In 1913, Ludwig Wittgenstein read a newspaper account of a Parisian courtroom where toy cars and dolls had been arranged on a table to show a jury how an automobile accident had occurred. In that simple scene of representation, miniature vehicles recreating the geometry of a real collision, he saw the answer to philosophy's deepest question. How does language reach beyond itself to make contact with reality? The toy cars weren't copies of actual vehicles, but something more fundamental. They shared logical structure. Spatial relationships between toys mirrored spatial relationships between the real cars at impact. This structural correspondence, Wittgenstein realized, was how all meaningful language functions. Propositions picture facts by sharing the same logical architecture. This vision of language as mirror to reality structure became the Tractus Logico-Philosophicus, a system of such crystalline completeness that its creator believed he had solved philosophy's fundamental problems once and for all. The problems of philosophy have been finally solved, Wittgenstein declared, and meant it without arrogance. Having mapped language's logical scaffolding with mathematical precision, he abandoned academic philosophy entirely, convinced there was nothing left to do. Yet Wittgenstein's story contains a twist that makes it unique in philosophy's history. The same mind that declared philosophy complete would later dismantle its own masterpiece, spending 2 decades developing an entirely different approach to language, meaning, and thought. Born into Vienna's industrial elite in 1889, heir to one of Europe's wealthiest families through his father's steel empire, Wittgenstein might have lived comfortably on inherited fortune. Instead, he pursued philosophy with an intensity that burned through every assumption, including eventually his own. The transformation wasn't abandonment, but something stranger, a deeper consistency. Both the early vision of language as logical mirror and the later understanding of language as woven into human activities shared a single therapeutic goal, showing philosophy's proper limits, freeing thought from the confusions that traditional metaphysics generated. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent, the young Wittgenstein proclaimed, drawing a sharp boundary around meaningful discourse. Philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language, the later Wittgenstein insisted, showing how philosophical problems dissolve when we understand how words actually function. These 2 declarations, separated by decades and seemingly opposed in method, both point toward the same destination: clarity about thought's relationship to life's deepest concerns. What changes between them isn't the goal but the path. Not the therapeutic intent, but the understanding of where confusion originates and how it might be cured. To understand this transformation means beginning at the beginning, when a young Austrian arrived in Cambridge carrying a question that would change philosophy's course. 1910. Bertrand Russell's rooms. An unannounced visitor with burning intensity. Part 1. The Early Vision. Logic as the Scaffold of Reality. The year was 1910, when Ludwig Wittgenstein appeared unannounced at Bertrand Russell's rooms in Cambridge, carrying with him a question that would reshape philosophy. Was he a complete idiot or destined for philosophical greatness? Russell, initially taken aback by this intense Austrian's directness, soon discovered he was witnessing something extraordinary. Within months, Russell marveled at how quickly Wittgenstein grasped the logical innovations he and Frege had painstakingly developed, only to transcend them entirely. Where Russell and Frege had sought to clarify mathematical reasoning, Wittgenstein glimpsed something far more ambitious, a complete theory of how language mirrors reality's structure. This wasn't merely about improving logical notation or solving mathematical paradoxes. Wittgenstein saw that if meaningful propositions must share logical form with the facts they represent, then language and world possessed identical logical architecture. the implications were staggering. Here was a solution to the ancient puzzle of how thought connects to reality, not through mysterious correspondence relations, but through shared structure itself. As he would later write in Proposition 2.18, what any picture of whatever form must have in common with reality in order to be able to depict it, correctly or incorrectly, in any way at all, is logical form, that is to say, the form of reality. The picture theory emerged from this insight with crystalline precision. Just as a photograph shares spatial relationships with what it depicts, meaningful propositions share logical relationships with the facts they represent. This wasn't metaphor but literal structural identity. The logical constants and, or, not, if, then weren't arbitrary linguistic conventions, but reflections of reality's own combinatorial possibilities. Language could represent the world because it was built from the same logical materials. Wittgenstein organized this vision into the systematic architecture of the Tractus Logico-Philosophicus, with its famous numbered propositions, creating a logical hierarchy of breathtaking ambition. From 1, the world is all that is the case, through the intermediate stages of analysis, down to 7, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. Each level of numbering mapped a descent from the world's fundamental nature to the precise conditions of meaningful speech. Proposition 1.1 elaborates 1, whilst 1.1, 1, and 1.12 develop 1.1 further, creating a tree of logical dependency, where every insight supports and is supported by the whole. This wasn't merely systematic presentation but philosophical necessity. Wittgenstein believed every genuine philosophical problem addressed in the work had been definitively solved through this method. The crystalline purity he sought wasn't aesthetic preference, but logical requirement. If language truly mirrored reality's structure, then philosophy's task was mapping this correspondence with mathematical precision. Yet this very ambition contained a tension that would eventually tear the system apart. Could such systematic completeness capture the fluid complexity of how language actually functions in human life? The Tractarian vision demands ultimate simples. For Wittgenstein's early project to succeed, reality must decompose into fundamental elements that cannot be further analyzed, elements that serve as the unshakable foundation for all complexity. This isn't arbitrary metaphysical speculation, but logical necessity driven by the requirements of meaning itself. Objects are simple, Wittgenstein declares in Proposition 2.02. And crucially, objects make up the substance of the world. That is why they cannot be composite. The reasoning proves compelling. If everything could be further analyzed, if every apparent simple turned out to be complex, then analysis would never reach bedrock. Meaning would remain forever incomplete, forever dependent on further decomposition that never arrives at solid ground. This theoretical necessity shapes the entire architecture of the Tractatus. Language must mirror this structure precisely, possessing elementary propositions that correspond to these atomic facts. The system requires perfect structural correspondence. Just as reality decomposes into simple objects arranged in atomic facts, language must decompose into names that refer to these objects, combined in elementary propositions that picture these atomic arrangements. Without this foundation, the picture theory collapses before it begins. The independence requirement proves equally crucial for the system's coherence. Atomic facts must be logically independent of each other, standing in no necessary logical relations. Proposition 2.06. 1 establishes this principle. States of affairs are independent of one another. whilst 2.062 extends the requirement. From the existence or non-existence of one state of affairs, it is impossible to infer the existence or non-existence of another. This independence isn't merely convenient but essential. If atomic facts were logically connected, if the existence of one atomic fact necessitated or precluded another, we couldn't understand complex propositions as truth-functional combinations of simple ones. The entire edifice of logical analysis would crumble. Consider what this independence achieves. Each atomic fact stands alone, logically self-contained, neither requiring nor excluding any other atomic fact. This creates the perfect building blocks for complex reality. Atomic facts can combine in any logically possible way, generating the full range of possible worlds through different combinations of the same ultimate elements. Language mirrors this structure through elementary propositions that can be combined through logical operations to generate all possible complex propositions. The elegance of logical atomism emerges from this systematic unity. One structural principle governs both reality and language: decomposition into independent simples that combine to generate complexity. Elementary propositions picture atomic facts directly, whilst complex propositions arise through logical operations on these elementary units. Truth-functional analysis becomes possible because the independence of atomic facts ensures that complex propositions depend only on the truth values of their elementary components, not on hidden logical connections between atomic facts themselves. Wittgenstein envisions the complete description this enables. The totality of true elementary propositions is a description of the world, complete as to content. Every atomic fact finds its linguistic mirror in a true elementary proposition. Every false elementary proposition corresponds to an atomic fact that doesn't obtain. Together, these elementary propositions provide exhaustive information about reality's fundamental structure. Complex propositions add nothing to content but merely organize this elementary information through logical operations. This promises to solve fundamental philosophical puzzles about meaning, truth, and the relationship between thought and world through a single insight about structural correspondence. Wittgenstein discovered the key to philosophy's deepest puzzle whilst reading a newspaper account of a Parisian courtroom. The case involved an automobile accident, and to help the jury understand what had happened, lawyers arranged toy cars and dolls on a table to represent the actual vehicles and people involved in the collision. This simple scene of representation struck Wittgenstein with extraordinary force. Here was the answer to how language reaches beyond itself to make contact with reality. The toy cars weren't copies of the real vehicles. They shared something far more fundamental: logical structure. The spatial relationships between the toys mirrored the spatial relationships between the actual cars at the moment of impact. This structural correspondence made representation possible. Wittgenstein realized that all meaningful language works precisely this way. We picture facts to ourselves, he declared in Proposition 2.1 of the Tractus. A picture presents a situation in logical space, the existence and non-existence of states of affairs. The picture theory transforms our understanding of how propositions connect to reality. Just as a photograph represents a scene through spatial relationships between elements on film, propositions represent facts through logical relationships between names. When we say, "the cat is on the mat," the logical arrangement of words mirrors a possible arrangement of objects in reality. The proposition means what it does because its structure corresponds to a possible state of affairs. Wittgenstein captured this insight in Proposition 2.15. The fact that the elements of a picture are related to one another in a determinate way represents that things are related to one another in the same way. This structural sharing explains both meaning and truth in one revolutionary stroke. Propositions don't mean by referring to mysterious mental contents or abstract ideas. They mean by corresponding to possible arrangements of objects in logical space. A proposition is true when the arrangement it pictures actually obtains in reality, false when it doesn't. A proposition is a picture of reality. Wittgenstein announced in 4.01. A proposition is a model of reality as we imagine it. The implications cascade through traditional philosophical problems with devastating force. The ancient puzzle of how mind connects to world, how subjective thought grasps objective reality, dissolves under logical analysis. There is no mysterious gap between thought and world because both share the same structural possibilities. The logical form that makes propositions possible is identical to the logical form that makes facts possible. Reality and language are not separate realms requiring a bridge. They are manifestations of the same logical architecture. Yet the picture theory creates its own profound tension. If propositions picture facts by sharing logical structure, what can be said about this structural sharing itself? The very framework that makes meaningful discourse possible seems to lie beyond the reach of meaningful discourse. Wittgenstein had solved the problem of how language touches reality, but in doing so, he had discovered the limits of what language can meaningfully express. Part 2. The limits of language and the mystical. The Tractarian system drives itself to a remarkable boundary, one that illuminates the very nature of philosophical understanding. Wittgenstein discovers that the logical structure making language possible cannot itself be stated in language. Proposition 4.121 captures this fundamental insight. Propositions cannot represent logical form, it is mirrored in them. What finds its reflection in language? Language cannot represent. This creates a profound philosophical territory. The conditions enabling meaningful discourse must remain beyond meaningful discourse itself. The parallel with vision proves illuminating. The eye makes all seeing possible, yet cannot see itself seeing. Similarly, logical form makes all meaningful propositions possible, yet cannot become the subject of meaningful propositions. This boundary isn't a limitation to be overcome, but a recognition of how meaning operates. Logic shows itself in every meaningful sentence without ever becoming the topic of those sentences. This recognition transforms how we understand ethics, aesthetics, and life's deepest concerns. When we attempt to speak about these domains, we necessarily transgress language's limits and produce nonsense. Wittgenstein revealed this insight in his famous letter to Ludwig von Vicker about the Tractus. The book's point is an ethical one. All that which many others are babbling about today, one have defined in my book by being silent about it. The silence isn't empty, but pregnant with significance. Proposition 6.41 develops this theme. The sense of the world must lie outside the world. What makes life meaningful cannot be located among the facts that make up the world. Proposition 6.42 follows inevitably. So too, it is impossible for there to be propositions of ethics. This isn't skeptical defeat but recognition of what shows itself beyond factual discourse. Ethics, aesthetics, and the mystical don't disappear. They reveal themselves as belonging to what can be shown, but never said. Yet the Tractarian system faces a devastating paradox that threatens its entire foundation. The book's own propositions are nonsensical by its own rigorous standards, yet somehow they illuminate through their very failure. Proposition 6.54 confronts this paradox directly. My propositions serve as elucidations in the following way. Anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical when he has used them. The image of the ladder thrown away after climbing captures the peculiar nature of philosophical understanding. This creates extraordinary tension between the system's systematic ambitions and its ultimate self-undermining. The Tractus achieves philosophical insight precisely by demonstrating the impossibility of philosophical theorizing. What shows itself in this philosophical silence transforms our understanding of what philosophy can accomplish and what lies forever beyond its reach. The Tractarian system achieves something remarkable in its very completeness. Every meaningful proposition pictures a possible state of affairs. Every logical relationship displays itself through truth-functional operations. Every fact finds its place within the logical space of possibilities. The system seems to capture everything that can be meaningfully said about reality. Yet this comprehensive coverage of the sayable accomplishes something unexpected. It makes visible what remains forever beyond saying. This isn't a failure of the system, but its deepest insight. When we map out completely what can be stated as fact, we encounter the boundaries of factual discourse itself. That there are facts at all. That the world exists as a bounded totality. That anything possesses value or significance beyond mere factual description. These realities show themselves precisely in the functioning of meaningful language, whilst remaining unsayable within that language. Wittgenstein identifies this domain as the mystical, though he means something far more precise than religious doctrine or spiritual experience. It is not how things are in the world that is mystical, but that it exists. He writes in Proposition 6.44. The mystical concerns not any particular content within the world, but the sheer fact that there is a world at all. That reality presents itself as an organized totality rather than mere chaos. This insight deepens in Proposition 6.45. To view the world sub specie aeterni is to view it as a whole, a limited whole. Feeling the world as a limited whole. It is this that is mystical. The mystical emerges when we grasp the world not as an endless collection of facts, but as a bounded totality, a complete logical space within which all possibilities find their place. This perspective transcends any particular factual knowledge whilst making all factual knowledge possible. The parallel with Kant's transcendental philosophy is instructive but reveals crucial differences. Kant located the conditions that make experience possible in the structure of human cognition, the categories of understanding, the forms of intuition. Wittgenstein locates these conditions in logical structure itself. The mystical isn't about human limitations, but about logical necessity. Whatever makes factual discourse possible must remain beyond factual discourse, not because we cannot know it, but because it constitutes the very framework within which knowing occurs. This creates a profound respect for what transcends linguistic expression. There are, indeed, things that cannot be put into words, Wittgenstein observes. They make themselves manifest. They are what is mystical. The mystical doesn't hide behind language, but shows itself in language's very functioning. Every meaningful proposition, in successfully picturing reality, points beyond itself toward the conditions that make such picturing possible. The tension runs deep through the entire Tractarian project. The system's logical rigor leads inevitably to recognition of its own limits. The more precisely we map the structure of meaningful discourse, the more clearly we see what lies beyond that structure, whilst making it possible. Logic reveals not just what can be said, but what must remain unsaid. Not from ignorance, but from logical necessity. This generates a kind of philosophical wonder that differs entirely from mere puzzlement. We stand before the fact that meaningful discourse occurs at all, that reality organizes itself in ways that language can capture, that anything matters beyond the mere accumulation of true propositions. The mystical manifests in this wonder at the very possibility of meaning itself. Proposition 7 stands alone in the Tractus. Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. This isn't philosophy's admission of defeat, but its moment of triumph. Wittgenstein had constructed an entire logical edifice to reach this point. Every proposition, every analysis of elementary propositions and truth functions, every insight about the picture theory of language had been building toward this recognition. The silence isn't empty space where philosophy failed to penetrate, but the completion of philosophy's proper task, showing language its own limits. This final proposition gathers everything the Tractus achieved. Language, pictures, facts, logical form shows itself in meaningful propositions, and the totality of true propositions constitutes natural science. But the most important truths about ethics, aesthetics, the meaning of life, cannot be pictured because they aren't facts in the world, but conditions for there being a world at all. The silence protects these from the distortions that occur when we try to force them into propositional form. Wittgenstein believed he had solved all philosophical problems by showing that most of them arise from misunderstanding language's proper function. Yet this silence differs fundamentally from skeptical doubt or mystical obscurantism. The skeptic claims we cannot know certain truths. The mystic suggests hidden realities beyond ordinary understanding. Wittgenstein's silence acknowledges neither ignorance nor mystery but completion. What cannot be spoken shows itself in language's very functioning. As he wrote in his notebooks during this period, "What we cannot speak about, we must pass over in silence. But what shows itself in language, we cannot express by means of language. The ethical, the aesthetic, the mystical aren't absent from our experience, but present in ways that propositional language cannot capture without destroying. This creates a disciplined restraint that protects what matters most. The silence isn't pregnant with secrets waiting to be revealed, but with what already reveals itself to anyone who understands how language actually works. The logical structure of reality shows itself in every meaningful proposition. The ethical stance shows itself in how we live and speak. The aesthetic dimension shows itself in what we find compelling about certain arrangements of words or sounds or colors. Philosophy's task ends when it recognizes these limits and stops trying to say what can only be shown. The biographical context makes this silence even more remarkable. After completing the Tractus, Wittgenstein left philosophy entirely. He became an elementary school teacher in rural Austrian villages, convinced that philosophical problems had been definitively solved. He told Russell he would never work in philosophy again because there was nothing left to do. This wasn't temporary withdrawal, but intended permanent departure. The silence was meant to last forever. A final word that ended philosophy by showing its proper boundaries. For nearly a decade, Wittgenstein maintained this silence. He taught children arithmetic and grammar in mountain villages, designed and built a house for his sister in Vienna, worked as a gardener in a monastery. The philosopher who had revolutionized logic lived as though philosophical questions no longer existed because he had shown they were based on fundamental misunderstandings about language. Yet something eventually drew him back to Cambridge, back to philosophical conversation, back to the very activity he believed he had completed. The question haunts the entire later philosophy. Can such silence be maintained? And what drives a philosopher to speak again after believing he had said everything that could meaningfully be said? Part 3. The collapse of the system. Seeds of transformation. January 1929 marked one of philosophy's most dramatic homecomings. Ludwig Wittgenstein appeared unannounced at John Maynard Keynes's house in Cambridge, declaring simply, "One have come to see whether one have anything to say." After nearly a decade away from philosophy, convinced he had solved all fundamental problems in the Tractus Logico-Philosophicus, Wittgenstein was returning to discover that his perfect logical system was crumbling from within. The cracks had begun to show through conversations with Frank Ramsey, the brilliant young Cambridge philosopher who had translated the Tractatus into English. Ramsey possessed an uncanny ability to identify the precise points where philosophical theories broke down, and his probing questions about elementary propositions had begun to unsettle Wittgenstein's confidence. By 1929, Wittgenstein was forced to admit publicly what his private notebooks had been recording. One was wrong in supposing that our analysis must respect the multiplicity of the proposition. This confession, delivered in his lecture, Some Remarks on Logical Form, represented far more than a minor adjustment. The entire Tractarian edifice depended on the existence of elementary propositions, simple, independent statements that would serve as the logical atoms of all meaningful discourse. These propositions were supposed to be completely analyzable into their constituent parts, each part corresponding to a simple object in reality. Yet when Wittgenstein attempted to identify such propositions in actual language, they proved systematically elusive. Consider the apparently simple statement, "This is red." According to the Tractus, this should decompose into elementary propositions about simple objects and their properties. But Wittgenstein discovered that color statements involve complex logical relationships that resist such decomposition. If something is red, it cannot simultaneously be blue or green. These exclusion relationships suggested that color propositions are not independent, but form interconnected systems of meaning that cannot be broken down into truly atomic elements. The problem extended far beyond color statements. Every attempt to identify genuine elementary propositions led to the same result. What appeared simple on the surface revealed complex logical dependencies beneath. The search for logical atoms, rather than reaching bedrock, seemed to generate infinite regress. Each proposed elementary proposition, when examined closely, proved to depend on other propositions for its meaning, which in turn depended on others, and so on without end. Mathematics presented an even more devastating challenge to the Tractarian system. Mathematical propositions like 2 + 2 = 4 are clearly meaningful and important, yet they fit nowhere in the truth-functional model that was supposed to account for all meaningful discourse. They don't picture facts about the world in the way that empirical propositions supposedly do, nor are they tautologies that say nothing about reality. Wittgenstein began to suspect that mathematical statements function not as descriptions of abstract objects, but as rules for manipulating symbols, insight that would prove revolutionary. This recognition struck at the heart of the correspondence theory of meaning. If mathematical propositions don't gain their meaning by corresponding to mathematical facts, then perhaps meaning itself works differently than the Tractus had supposed. The elegant system that had seemed to solve the fundamental problems of philosophy was failing to account for vast domains of meaningful discourse that couldn't be reduced to factual description. The Tractarian system, despite its logical beauty, was proving inadequate to the complexity of actual language use. Wittgenstein found himself confronting the possibility that his early work, rather than reaching the final truth about language and logic, had been based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how meaning actually functions in human life. Logic had failed him. The crystalline structure of the Tractus, with its picture theory and atomic facts, had crumbled under scrutiny. Yet Wittgenstein did not abandon the search for philosophical foundations entirely. Instead, he turned inward. toward the immediate flow of consciousness itself. Between 1929 and 1930, he embarked on a brief but crucial experiment. Could phenomenological analysis succeed where logical analysis had failed? Could the structure of experience provide the bedrock that language's logical structure could not? This phenomenological turn represented a dramatic shift in his philosophical methodology. Rather than analyzing language's correspondence to logical facts, Wittgenstein now sought to analyze consciousness's direct encounter with reality. He believed that by carefully describing immediate experience, the flow of sensations, perceptions, and mental states as they actually occur, he might discover the true foundation for meaning and knowledge. The approach seemed promising. Surely our most basic experiential reports, our direct descriptions of what we see, feel, and think, must possess an immediacy and certainty that logical constructions lacked. Wittgenstein's notebooks from this period reveal his intense focus on the grammar of experiential language. What one have to do is not to reduce physical objects to sense data, but to give the grammar of our expression concerning physical objects. He wrote, this insight already contained the seeds of his later revolution. He was not seeking to reduce the external world to private mental contents, but rather to understand how our language about experience actually functions. Yet even this grammatical focus could not resolve the deeper problems that phenomenological analysis encountered. The more deeply Wittgenstein investigated immediate experience, the more elusive it became. Even the most basic experiential reports, one see red, one feel pain, one remember yesterday, required concepts, rules, and criteria that seemed to transcend individual consciousness entirely. The attempt to describe pure experience immediately involved complex grammatical structures that could not themselves be reduced to experiential elements. How could one phenomenologically analyze the concept of memory without already possessing criteria for distinguishing genuine memories from false ones? How could one describe the experience of seeing red without employing color concepts that extend far beyond any single experiential moment? Wittgenstein's growing realization was profound and troubling. Describing immediate experience requires a conceptual apparatus that cannot itself be immediately experienced. The phenomenological method demanded a language of description, but this language brought with it all the complexities and rule-governed structures that the method was supposed to circumvent. Every attempt to capture experience in its pure immediacy involved concepts whose meaning depended on their role within broader linguistic and cultural practices. The private, immediate, and certain foundation that phenomenology promised proved as elusive as the logical atoms of his earlier philosophy. This recognition led to a deeper insight that would transform his entire approach to philosophy. The attempt to ground meaning in experiential certainty faced precisely the same infinite regress problems as logical atomism. Just as atomic facts required further facts to explain their combination, immediate experiences required conceptual frameworks to explain their significance. The grammar of our language, Wittgenstein began to see, does not simply mirror the structure of reality or experience, but constitutes the boundaries within which meaningful discourse is possible. The phenomenological phase thus revealed something crucial. Meaning cannot be grounded in either logical or experiential foundations. Wittgenstein's revolutionary breakthrough emerged from a startling recognition. Philosophical problems don't require theoretical solutions, but therapeutic dissolution. As he declares in the Philosophical Investigations section 109, philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. This represents nothing less than a complete reconception of philosophy's fundamental nature. Traditional philosophical problems, Wittgenstein came to realize, don't arise from deep metaphysical puzzles requiring systematic solutions, but from misunderstanding how language actually functions in our lives. The elaborate theoretical edifices constructed by centuries of philosophers weren't solving genuine problems, but multiplying confusions by building grand systems on conceptual mistakes. This therapeutic vision crystallized around Wittgenstein's identification of what he termed the Augustinian picture of language as the primary source of philosophical bewilderment. The philosophical investigations opens with a famous passage from Augustine's Confessions, where the saint describes learning language by observing adults name objects and imitating their behavior. Augustine writes of pointing, naming, and the gradual acquisition of words as labels for things in the world. This seemingly innocent description, Wittgenstein recognized, contains the seeds of philosophical confusion that have plagued Western thought for millennia. The Augustinian picture presents language as fundamentally referential. Words, name, objects, sentences combine these names to describe reality, and meaning consists in the relationship between linguistic signs and the things they designate. This picture appears so natural, so obviously correct, that it becomes invisible to us. Yet Wittgenstein saw that this deceptively simple account generates the very problems that traditional philosophy attempts to solve. If words are names and sentences are descriptions, then how do mind and world connect? What makes our descriptions true or false? How can we know that our language corresponds to reality? The entire apparatus of epistemology, metaphysics, and philosophy of mind springs from accepting this picture of language's essential nature. Wittgenstein's therapeutic method emerged as a radical alternative to philosophical system building. Rather than constructing theories about how language must work, he began investigating how language actually works in the concrete contexts of human life. His famous injunction encapsulates this methodological transformation. Instead of reasoning from first principles about the nature of meaning, reference, and truth, Wittgenstein advocated careful attention to the actual phenomena of linguistic practice. This represents not merely a change in philosophical doctrine, but a complete transformation of philosophy's purpose and method. Philosophy becomes therapy rather than theory, dissolution rather than solution, liberation from conceptual confusion rather than construction of systematic knowledge. The philosopher's task is no longer to answer traditional philosophical questions, but to show how these questions rest on linguistic misunderstandings that dissolve once we see how language actually functions in human life. Part 4. Language Games, the New Foundation. Wittgenstein opens the philosophical investigations with a deceptively simple scene. A builder calls slab, and his assistant brings a slab, calls block, and the assistant brings a block. This mundane interaction, he argues, illustrates a complete language game in its most primitive form. The language is meant to serve for communication between a builder A and an assistant B. A is building with building stones. There are blocks, pillars, slabs, and beams. B has to pass the stones, and that in the order in which A needs them. What appears trivial reveals language's essential nature as coordinated activity rather than descriptive representation. This primitive language game works through successful coordination within shared practices rather than through correspondence to facts. When the builder calls slab, the word doesn't derive its meaning from naming an object or referring to an abstract concept. Instead, it functions as a call for action, playing a specific role within the building activity. The meaning emerges from use in context, not from pointing beyond itself to some independent reality. Wittgenstein's revolutionary insight crystallizes here. The meaning of a word is its use in the language. This primitive system operates perfectly without requiring correspondence between words and abstract meanings, logical structures, or mental contents that traditional philosophy insisted must underlie all meaningful language. Even this basic language game involves training, criteria, and normative expectations about correct and incorrect moves. The assistant must learn not merely to associate sounds with objects, but to respond appropriately within the building activity's context. This learning process reveals something profound about language's nature. The child learns this language from the grown-ups by being trained to its use. Wittgenstein observes, "The training doesn't involve explaining abstract rules or definitions, but rather participating in the activity until the responses become natural and automatic. Language games are woven into action, purpose, and forms of life, rather than floating above them as detached, symbolic systems. The builder and assistant's coordination depends on shared understanding of the building project, recognition of when stones are needed, and mastery of the timing and rhythm of construction work. Their language doesn't describe this activity from outside, but forms an integral part of it. Remove the building context and the words lose their meaning entirely. This simple model challenges philosophy's traditional assumption that language primarily functions to represent reality, suggesting instead that meaning emerges from participation in shared practices and purposeful activities that constitute human forms of life. The opening of Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations presents a deceptively simple passage from Augustine's Confessions, yet this quotation becomes the foundation for demolishing our most basic assumptions about language. Augustine recalls, "When they, my elders, named some object, and accordingly moved towards something, one saw this, and one grasped that the thing was called by the sound they uttered when they meant to point it out." This description captures what Wittgenstein calls the Augustinian picture of language, the seemingly obvious idea that words function primarily as names for objects, that sentences combine these names to describe reality, and that meaning emerges through ostensive definition and descriptive correspondence. This picture appears self-evidently correct for certain uses of language. When someone points to a red apple and says apple, the word does seem to name the object through direct correspondence. When we describe the weather or report events, language does appear to mirror reality through accurate representation. The Augustinian model works perfectly for these paradigmatic cases, which is precisely why it seems to capture language's essential nature. Yet Wittgenstein recognizes that this apparent obviousness conceals a profound philosophical trap, the assumption that all meaningful language must work essentially the same way. The revolutionary insight emerges when we examine what we actually do with words in their natural habitats. Wittgenstein provides a famous catalogue in section 23 of the Investigations. Review the multiplicity of language games in the following examples, and in others: giving orders and obeying them, describing the appearance of an object or giving its measurements, constructing an object from a description, a drawing, reporting an event, speculating about an event, forming and testing a hypothesis, presenting the results of an experiment in tables and diagrams, making up a story and reading it, play acting, singing catches, guessing riddles, making a joke, telling it, solving a problem in practical arithmetic, translating from one language into another, asking, thanking, cursing, greeting, praying. Each activity in this list operates according to completely different criteria for success. A command succeeds when it produces appropriate action, not when it accurately describes reality. A joke succeeds when it generates laughter through surprise or incongruity, not when it corresponds to facts. A prayer succeeds through establishing relationship with the divine, not through descriptive accuracy about empirical states of affairs. What makes a hypothesis valuable differs entirely from what makes a greeting appropriate or a mathematical solution correct. This multiplicity shatters any attempt to locate language's single essence. Traditional philosophy sought the fundamental nature that unifies all meaningful discourse, whether through reference, truth conditions, logical form, or communicative intention. Wittgenstein's catalogue demonstrates that no single mechanism underlies this vast diversity of linguistic activities. Instead of producing something common to all that we call language, he concludes, "One am saying that these phenomena have no one thing in common, which makes us use the same word for all." Language games share only what Wittgenstein calls family resemblances, overlapping similarities without essential unity. Just as family members might share certain features without any single characteristic common to all, language games exhibit crisscrossing patterns of similarity and difference. Commands and descriptions both use words, but so do songs and prayers. Jokes and hypotheses both involve creativity, but so do greetings and translations. The resemblances form a complex network without a unifying center. This recognition creates a fundamental tension that transforms our understanding of meaning itself. If language lacks essential unity, how do we navigate between different language games? Language games don't float in conceptual isolation. They are embedded in what Wittgenstein calls forms of life, the broader patterns of activity, expectation, and response that give them their meaning and possibility. These forms of life constitute the deep grammar of human existence, the background against which our words acquire their sense and our actions, their significance. What has to be accepted, the given, is, so one could say, forms of life, pointing to something more fundamental than individual utterances or even particular games. Understanding a language means mastering not merely vocabulary but the forms of life in which words have their natural home. When we grasp what it means to promise, we don't simply learn a definition or memorize a linguistic formula. We enter into practices of commitment, expectation, and accountability that make promising possible as a meaningful human activity. The word promise gains its life from a complex web of social practices, the solemnity with which promises are made, the disappointment when they're broken, the elaborate rituals through which serious commitments are undertaken, the ways communities respond to promise breakers and promise keepers alike. These practices aren't merely the external context in which language operates. They are constitutive of meaning itself. The promising game requires participants who understand the weight of commitment, who can distinguish between casual remarks and serious undertakings, who know how to hold others accountable whilst recognizing their own accountability. Remove these practices, and the word promise becomes an empty sound. The form of life gives the language game its substance. The rules governing these language games aren't explicit regulations we consult before speaking. They are implicit patterns of normative practice woven into the fabric of our activities. Wittgenstein reveals how we follow rules without possessing theoretical understanding of what we're doing. We know how to continue the series 2, 4, 6, 8 without grasping arithmetic progression as a mathematical concept. We recognize correct and incorrect moves in conversation without studying pragmatic theory. Rule following is a practice embedded in training and natural reactions rather than conscious interpretation. This insight generates a profound paradox that strikes at the heart of philosophical thinking about rules and meaning. This was our paradox. No course of action could be determined by a rule, because any course of action can be made out to accord with the rule. Wittgenstein observes, if rules require interpretation, and interpretations themselves require further interpretation, we face an infinite regress that makes rule following impossible. Yet we do follow rules successfully, constantly, and naturally. The solution lies in recognizing that rule following isn't a matter of interpretation at all. It's a practice we're trained into through countless examples, corrections, and responses. When a child learns to count, she doesn't master a theory about numerical sequences. She learns to respond appropriately through repetition, encouragement, and gentle correction until the pattern becomes second nature. The rule lives in the practice, not in any formulation we might give of it. Forms of life provide the bedrock where philosophical explanation comes to an end. If one have exhausted the justifications, one have reached bedrock, and my spade is turned, then one am inclined to say, this is simply what one do, Wittgenstein announces, pointing to the limits of rational justification. We can explain why particular moves within a language game are appropriate or inappropriate, but we cannot step outside all forms of life to justify the forms of life themselves. This groundlessness isn't skeptical defeat but recognition of where philosophical explanation properly stops. Part 5. Meaning as use. The revolutionary insight. The most revolutionary sentence in 20th century philosophy appears in the Philosophical Investigations at section 43. The meaning of a word is its use in the language. This deceptively simple declaration overturns centuries of philosophical thinking about how language connects to reality. Where traditional theories sought meaning in correspondence relations between words and things, or in mental associations between signs and ideas, Wittgenstein relocates meaning entirely into the practical domain of human activity. This isn't a definition of meaning so much as a therapeutic redirection. Instead of asking the traditional question, what do words mean? Which inevitably leads us into metaphysical puzzles about the relationship between language and reality, Wittgenstein suggests, we ask, how do words function in human activities? This shift dissolves rather than solves the classical problems. We no longer need to explain the mysterious bridge between linguistic signs and worldly facts, because meaning resides in observable practices, not in hidden connections. The genius of this approach becomes clear when we see how it differs from both mentalism and behaviorism. Meaning as use isn't behaviorism because it recognizes the normative dimension of linguistic practices. There are right and wrong ways to use words, not merely different patterns of behavior. When Wittgenstein observes that understanding a sentence means understanding a language, he reveals that linguistic competence involves mastery of normative practices within language games rather than mere behavioral conditioning. Words acquire meaning by playing specific roles in specific contexts of activity rather than by standing for mental contents or external objects. The word checkmate means what it does, not because it corresponds to some abstract game state, but because of how it functions within the practice of chess, what moves it allows, what responses it demands, what consequences it triggers. Similarly, one promise gets its meaning from its role in the practice of making commitments, not from any mental state it expresses or external fact it describes. Wittgenstein's methodological injunction becomes crucial here. We must look and see how words actually function, rather than theorizing about how they must function. This approach reveals meaning's context sensitivity without falling into relativism. Words have stable uses within established practices, even though those uses vary dramatically across different language games. The word game itself functions differently when we're teaching children, analyzing strategy, or settling disputes, yet it maintains coherent sense within each context. This practical approach to meaning transforms our understanding of linguistic competence. Knowing what a word means isn't possessing some theoretical knowledge about correspondence relations, but rather having mastered the techniques for using that word appropriately within relevant practices. Understanding emerges through participation in shared forms of life, rather than through grasping abstract semantic theories. When we encounter the word game, we instinctively feel we know what it means. Board games, card games, football, chess, hide and seek. Surely they all share some essential feature that makes them games rather than work, or ritual, or art. This intuition drives much of traditional philosophy, the assumption that words must correspond to fixed essences, that meaning requires some underlying commonality, binding all applications together. Wittgenstein shattered this assumption with devastating simplicity. Consider, for example, the proceedings that we call games. He writes in the Philosophical Investigations. One mean board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games. What is common to them all? Don't say, there must be something common, or they would not be called games, but look and see whether there is anything common to all. This instruction transforms philosophical methodology from theoretical speculation to careful observation of actual usage. Looking rather than theorizing reveals something extraordinary. Some games involve competition, others pure amusement. Some require skill, others depend entirely on luck. Some are played alone, others demand teams. Some have winners and losers, others simply continue until participants tire. The search for the essential feature of gameness fails because there is no single thread running through all applications, only what Wittgenstein called family resemblances, overlapping similarities that connect various uses without any universal common denominator. This discovery extends far beyond games. The word functions differently in different contexts, not because we're confused about its real meaning, but because it performs different work within different practices. When a parent suggests a game to restless children, when philosophers discuss game theory, when anthropologists analyze ritual games, when Olympic officials define competitive games, the word operates according to different criteria, serves different purposes, connects to different patterns of activity. Context doesn't merely help us determine what words mean. It partially constitutes meaning by providing the background against which words can make sense at all. Wittgenstein recognized that the speaking of language is part of an activity. Words derive their significance from their role within ongoing human practices, not from their correspondence to abstract entities existing independently of use. Consider how water functions across different contexts. Shouted by someone dying of thirst, it expresses urgent need and calls for immediate assistance. Called out by a firefighter, it coordinates emergency response and signals specific tactical requirements. Uttered by a chemist discussing molecular structure, it refers to H2O and connects to theoretical frameworks about chemical bonding. The word performs different work because each context provides different criteria for appropriate response, different standards for success, different connections to ongoing activities. Meaning emerges from this intersection of word, context, and established patterns of use rather than from correspondence to fixed entities. The chemist's water and the thirsty person's water don't refer to different things. They function according to different criteria within different language games. Understanding meaning requires grasping these contextual criteria, not penetrating to some essential core beneath surface applications. This contextual approach dissolves traditional philosophical problems by transforming the questions we ask. Instead of seeking the essential nature of knowledge, justice, or beauty, we investigate how these concepts function within different contexts of inquiry, evaluation, and appreciation. Wittgenstein's revolutionary insight begins with a deceptively simple comparison. Think of the tools in a toolbox. There is a hammer, pliers, a saw, a screwdriver, a rule, a glue pot, glue, nails, and screws. He writes in the Philosophical Investigations, "The functions of words are as diverse as the functions of these objects." This analogy transforms our entire understanding of language by revealing something profound about the nature of meaning itself. The brilliance of this comparison lies in what it shows us about asking the wrong questions. When we examine a toolbox, we never ask, "What is the essence of all tools?" Such a question would strike us as absurd. A hammer and a measuring rule serve completely different purposes within different activities. The hammer drives nails, the rule measures lengths, the saw cuts wood. Each tool gains its identity from its specific function within particular practices. Similarly, words derive their meaning not from some shared essence, but from their diverse roles within the countless activities that make up human life. Consider how philosophical confusion arises when we ignore this fundamental diversity. Traditional philosophy has long sought the essence of meaning, assuming all words must work in fundamentally the same way. This approach creates the very problems it attempts to solve. When we ask, "What is meaning?" without reference to specific contexts, we're like someone trying to understand tools by seeking what hammers, saws, and measuring rules have essentially in common, rather than examining how each functions within particular activities. The toolbox analogy reveals why so many philosophical problems dissolve under careful examination. Wittgenstein observes that philosophical problems arise when language goes on holiday, when words are removed from the contexts that give them sense and forced to work in alien environments. This happens constantly in traditional metaphysics. We take words that function perfectly well in ordinary circumstances and demand they perform impossible tasks in abstract, theoretical contexts. Think of asking, "What is time?" as a philosophical question. Outside any specific context of measuring duration, planning future events, or remembering past experiences, this question creates puzzles that seem to demand metaphysical answers. Yet these puzzles vanish when we return the word time to its natural habitat, the countless ordinary activities where temporal concepts actually function. We measure cooking time, schedule appointments, remember birthdays, anticipate holidays. In each context, temporal language works perfectly without requiring abstract theoretical foundations. This instrumental understanding of language prepares us for one of Wittgenstein's most important insights. To imagine a language means to imagine a form of life. Words are not isolated units of meaning, but instruments embedded within human activities. Learning language involves mastering the diverse tools available for different communicative purposes, describing physical objects, commanding actions, questioning assumptions, making promises, expressing emotions, telling jokes, offering prayers, giving directions, sharing memories. Each type of linguistic activity employs different instruments for different purposes. The language game of describing a sunset uses different tools than the language game of promising to meet someone tomorrow. The vocabulary might overlap, but the instruments serve distinct functions within different forms of human activity. Understanding language means recognizing this instrumental diversity rather than seeking some unified theory of how all words must work. This insight has profound implications for philosophical methodology. If meaning emerges from use within specific practices, then philosophical problems often result from misusing our linguistic instruments. We take words that function as hammers in ordinary life and try to use them as measuring devices in abstract theory. Part 6. The Private Language Argument: Dismantling Inner Objects. Wittgenstein presents us with one of philosophy's most elegant thought experiments in section 293 of the Philosophical Investigations. Suppose everyone had a box with something in it, and we call this thing a beetle. No one can look into anyone else's box, and everyone says he knows what a beetle is only by looking at his beetle. Here we have the perfect analogy for how traditional philosophy conceives mental language. Each person has private access to their own sensations, emotions, and thoughts, but no access to anyone else's inner life. When we use words like pain or joy, we seem to be naming these private mental objects, just as beetle would name the private object in each person's box. The thought experiment reveals its devastating conclusion through careful reasoning. It would be quite possible for everyone to have something completely different in their box. One might even imagine the contents constantly changing. But suppose the word beetle had a use in these people's language. If so, it would not be used as the name of a thing. The thing in the box has no place in the language game at all, not even as a something, for the box might even be empty. This strikes at the heart of how we typically think about mental terms. If pain functioned like beetle in this scenario, referring to private sensations accessible only to each individual, then the actual private contents would be irrelevant to public meaning. The beetle argument exposes a fundamental confusion in our grammar of mental terms. We naturally assume that pain, thought, and sensation function like table or chair, albeit private mental objects rather than public physical ones. Wittgenstein observes that the grammar of the word seems to point to a noun, and so we think of pain as a thing. This grammatical seduction leads us to imagine that learning mental vocabulary involves a kind of private ostensive definition, where we point inwardly to name our sensations, establishing personal meanings through direct acquaintance with private objects. Yet the beetle reveals why private, ostensive definition cannot work. For a word to have meaning in a public language, there must be public criteria for its correct application. If mental terms referred to genuinely private objects, there could be no shared standards for using them correctly. The supposed private act of naming one's sensation would be like each person privately deciding what counts as a beetle, whilst looking only into their own box. Without public criteria, we cannot distinguish between correct and incorrect applications of the term. The private object drops out of consideration as irrelevant to meaning, just as the actual contents of each person's box become irrelevant to how beetle functions in their shared language. This argument dismantles the entire picture of mental language as involving reference to private objects. It suggests that when mental terms do have meaning, they must function quite differently from how traditional philosophy imagines, not through private reference, but through their role in public language games with observable criteria and shared forms of life. How do words refer to sensations? Wittgenstein poses this question with deceptive simplicity in the Philosophical Investigations, noting that there doesn't seem to be any problem here. Don't we talk about sensations every day and give them names? Yet this everyday obviousness conceals a profound conceptual puzzle that strikes at the heart of how we understand language, mind, and meaning itself. The traditional answer seems straightforward enough. Pain words refer to private sensations, inner objects accessible only to the person experiencing them. We learn what pain means by associating the word with our own private sensations, then apply it to others by analogy. But Wittgenstein demonstrates the impossibility of this account through a devastating logical analysis. If pain words truly referred to private sensations, how could we possibly learn what pain means? We cannot point to others' private sensations to establish the public meaning of the word, since these supposed inner objects remain forever hidden from view. Nor can pointing to our own private sensations establish criteria that others can recognize and correct, since they lack access to what we're supposedly pointing toward. This impossibility reveals something fundamental about the nature of sensation language itself. Wittgenstein offers a revolutionary alternative that dissolves the puzzle entirely. Words are connected with the primitive, the natural, expressions of the sensation and used in their place. Pain language doesn't describe inner states, but expresses and elaborates natural pain behavior. When a child learns to say, "One am in pain," they're not learning to report on private objects, but to replace and refine their natural expressions of pain. They're crying, groaning, and writhing. With more sophisticated linguistic behavior, this insight transforms our understanding of how sensation language actually functions. The utterance, "One am in pain," stands in grammatical continuity with crying, rather than in descriptive relation to some private cause of crying. Pain language emerges from and remains rooted in the natural expressions that constitute our primitive responses to injury and distress. Learning to articulate pain represents a development of expressive capacity rather than the acquisition of descriptive vocabulary for inner objects. This expressive account explains the peculiar grammar of pain language without postulating mysterious private objects. The asymmetry between first-person and third-person pain statements, the fact that one express my pain whilst observing your pain behavior, reflects different grammatical roles rather than different epistemic access to the same private entities. When one say, "One am in pain," one not reporting on privileged access to an inner object, but engaging in sophisticated pain behavior. When one say, "You are in pain," one responding to observable criteria according to patterns learned through training in human practices. Wittgenstein emphasizes that only of a living human being and what resembles, behaves like, a living human being can one say, it has sensations, it sees, is blind, hears, is deaf, is conscious or unconscious. This grammatical insight reveals that sensation concepts apply primarily to whole persons engaged in characteristic forms of life rather than to supposed inner objects housed within persons. Others don't infer my pain from external evidence of internal states, but respond directly to pain behavior according to criteria embedded in shared human practices. Yet this dissolution of private objects creates its own tensions. Can an expressive account truly capture the apparent privacy and immediacy that seems so essential to inner experience? The grammar of sensation language suggests something more complex than either private object theories or simple behaviorism can accommodate. A domain where expression and experience interweave in ways that resist traditional philosophical categories. The private language argument rests upon a more fundamental insight about the nature of rule-following itself. Wittgenstein recognized that following a rule requires the ability to distinguish between correct and incorrect applications of that rule. Without this distinction, we have no rule at all, merely arbitrary behavior masquerading as rule-governed activity. Private rules, he demonstrates, cannot provide this essential distinction between right and wrong applications. Consider Wittgenstein's famous thought experiment from the Philosophical Investigations. He asks us to imagine someone attempting to keep a diary about a recurring private sensation. One speak or write the sign down, and at the same time, one concentrate my attention on the sensation, and so, as it were, point to it inwardly. This person assigns the sign E to mark each occurrence of this particular inner experience. The question becomes, how can this private ostensive definition establish any meaningful rule for the correct reapplication of the sign? The problem reveals itself immediately. When this person encounters what might be the same sensation again, what determines whether applying the sign E is correct? The person cannot step outside their own perspective to verify the match. There exists no independent criterion, no external standard against which to measure the accuracy of the identification. The private realm offers no resources for establishing what counts as the same sensation versus a different one. Wittgenstein delivers the devastating insight that in such cases, whatever seems right to me is right. But this means there exists no genuine difference between seeming right and being right. Where this distinction collapses, we can no longer speak meaningfully of rules at all. As Wittgenstein concludes, that means that here we can't talk about right. Private rules dissolve into mere regularities without normative force. This insight extends far beyond diary keeping to encompass the entire structure of rule following. Wittgenstein observes that to think one is obeying a rule is not to obey a rule. Hence, it is not possible to obey a rule privately. Otherwise, thinking one was obeying a rule would be the same thing as obeying it. The very concept of rule following requires external criteria, public standards that transcend private authority. This doesn't deny the reality of inner experience, but clarifies how mental concepts actually function in human life. One can indeed be wrong about whether one experiencing jealousy, nostalgia, or love, precisely because these concepts possess public criteria that extend beyond my private authority. The criteria for applying these concepts are woven into our shared forms of life, our common practices and reactions. Wittgenstein captures this perfectly. The inner is not a something, but not a nothing either. The private language argument doesn't reduce mind to behavior or eliminate the inner realm. Instead, it reveals how mental concepts serve as tools for navigating human life, rather than labels for private objects accessible only to their possessor. This understanding transforms our entire approach to the mind. Mental concepts gain their meaning not through private ostensive definition, but through their role in our shared linguistic practices. The grammar of psychological language reflects not the structure of an inner realm, but the complex ways these concepts function in human interaction, expression, and understanding. The implications reach deep into the foundations of meaning itself, revealing how even our most intimate experiences require public criteria for their identification and expression. Part 7. Rule Following and the Paradox of Interpretation. Wittgenstein confronted philosophy with a paradox so fundamental it threatened to dissolve the very possibility of linguistic meaning. The paradox emerges from a deceptively simple observation. Any rule can be interpreted in infinitely many ways, making it impossible for interpretation alone to determine a unique way of following that rule. This insight strikes at the heart of our ordinary understanding of how language works, revealing assumptions we rarely question about meaning and rule following. Consider Wittgenstein's famous example from the Philosophical Investigations. A student has learned to continue number series like 2, 4, 6, 8, and successfully continues up to 1,000. But when asked to go beyond 1,000, the student writes 1,004, 1,008, 1,012. The student insists they are following the same rule they learned, which they understand as add 2 up to 1,000, then add 4. This interpretation remains perfectly consistent with every previous application of the rule. The student's behavior accords with all the training they received, yet produces results we would call incorrect. This example illuminates a deeper philosophical crisis. The student's interpretation demonstrates that no finite set of examples can uniquely determine how a rule applies to new cases. Any rule, no matter how clearly stated or extensively demonstrated, remains open to interpretations that diverge from our intended meaning. The rule, add 2, could mean add 2 until Tuesday, or add 2 unless the number contains a 7. These interpretations, however bizarre they seem, cannot be ruled out by the rule itself or by any finite collection of examples. Wittgenstein formulated this insight with characteristic precision. This was our paradox. No course of action could be determined by a rule, because any course of action can be made out to accord with the rule. The paradox generalizes beyond mathematical examples to threaten all meaningful language use. If meaning depends on interpretation, and interpretation always remains open to further interpretation, we face an infinite regress that makes determinate meaning impossible. Every word, every concept, every linguistic rule becomes vulnerable to the same interpretive instability. The paradox emerges specifically from our assumption that rule following must be grounded in mental interpretation of abstract meanings. The traditional philosophical picture assumes that understanding a rule involves grasping its meaning and then applying that interpretation to guide behavior in new cases. We imagine that when someone learns the rule add 2, they acquire an internal representation or understanding that determines how the rule should be applied across all possible cases. But Wittgenstein reveals how this picture generates the very paradox it was meant to solve. As he puts it, any interpretation still hangs in the air, along with what it interprets, and cannot give it any support. The interpretation itself becomes another rule requiring interpretation. If we need an interpretation to follow the rule, add 2, we then need an interpretation of that interpretation, and so on indefinitely. The theoretical understanding we thought would ground rule following instead opens an abyss of interpretive possibilities. This paradox reveals the futility of trying to ground rule following in theoretical understanding rather than practical mastery. The search for foundations in mental interpretation leads not to bedrock, but to quicksand. Yet we do follow rules successfully. We do communicate meaningfully. We do continue mathematical series correctly. The paradox therefore points toward a fundamental reconceptualization of what rule following actually involves, dissolving the problem by abandoning the assumptions that created it. Wittgenstein dissolves the rule-following paradox through a radical insight. Rule following is a practice, not an interpretation. In the Philosophical Investigations section 201, he delivers the crucial revelation. What this shews is that there is a way of grasping a rule which is not an interpretation, but which is exhibited in what we call obeying the rule and going against it in actual cases. When we encounter the series 2, we simply continue with 10, 12, 14, without consulting mental interpretations or theoretical understanding of arithmetic progression. This practical mastery proves more fundamental than any theoretical account of what rules mean. The philosopher demonstrates that we don't follow rules by first interpreting them and then acting. Instead, we act directly from our training. The child learning to count doesn't deliberate about the nature of numerical sequence. She simply continues the pattern she has been taught. This immediate response reveals something profound about the nature of rule following itself. We grasp rules through doing, through the lived practice of continuing patterns, applying concepts, following instructions. Correctness in rule following emerges through community agreement in practice rather than correspondence to abstract meanings. Wittgenstein reveals that to obey a rule, to make a report, to give an order, to play a game of chess, are customs, uses, institutions. What counts as following the rule correctly becomes established through training within shared practices rather than through individual interpretation of rule meanings. The mathematical community agrees that continuing 2, 4 with 10, 12, 14 is correct. Not because we've all grasped the same abstract rule meaning, but because we've been trained into the same practice. This doesn't make rule following arbitrary. It grounds rule following in stable human practices and natural reactions. The agreement isn't a mere convention that could be otherwise. It's rooted in our shared human nature, our capacity for pattern recognition, our natural responses to training. The child who continues 2, 4, 6, 8 with 10, 12, 14 demonstrates not arbitrary choice, but the successful absorption of mathematical practice. The bedrock of rule following lies in training and natural reactions rather than theoretical understanding. Wittgenstein declares with striking directness, "When 1, obey a rule, 1 do not choose. 1, obey the rule blindly. 1, obey the rule blindly." This blindness isn't ignorance, but the immediacy of trained response. We continue mathematical series, follow grammatical patterns, and apply concepts without deliberation because we have been trained into these practices. The competent English speaker doesn't consult grammatical theory before forming the past tense of walk. She simply says, walked, from absorbed linguistic training. When pressed to justify our rule-following practices, we eventually reach explanatory bedrock. Wittgenstein captures this with memorable imagery. If 1 have exhausted the justifications, 1 have reached bedrock, and my spade is turned. Then 1 am inclined to say, this is simply what 1 do. This groundlessness becomes the solution rather than a problem. It shows where philosophical explanation properly comes to an end, not in further theory, but in the recognition of practice itself. The dissolution reveals that the original paradox arose from a false picture of rule following as interpretation. Once we abandon the idea that following a rule requires grasping its meaning through interpretation, the paradox vanishes. Rules guide action not through meanings we grasp, but through practices we master. This transforms our understanding of normativity itself. Correctness and incorrectness aren't determined by correspondence to abstract standards, but by participation in shared forms of life. The rule-following considerations reveal Wittgenstein's revolutionary therapeutic approach in its purest form. Traditional philosophy confronts the normativity of rules with a characteristic demand. Explain how rule-following is possible. Ground it in something secure. Solve the puzzle of how finite training can determine infinite applications. Wittgenstein shows that this entire approach rests on false assumptions about how rules must work. The rule-following paradox emerges precisely from the assumption that rules require theoretical grounding in abstract meanings or mental interpretations. The problems are solved not by giving new information, but by arranging what we have always known, he observes. The therapeutic goal isn't to provide the theoretical foundations that philosophy demands, but to recognize that rule-following works perfectly well without them. Philosophy's task regarding rule-following isn't to explain how it's possible, but to describe how it actually works in human practices. Wittgenstein's methodological insight cuts through centuries of theoretical confusion. We must do away with all explanation, and description alone must take its place. When we carefully describe actual rule-following practices, we discover that the theoretical puzzles arise only when we abstract from those practices. The child learning arithmetic doesn't need a theory of mathematical objects or logical necessity. Training, correction, natural reactions, and the rough ground of human agreement suffice. Detailed description of these practices dissolves the theoretical puzzles that emerge when philosophers demand something deeper than practice itself. This descriptive approach reveals the groundlessness of our most basic practices without undermining their stability or effectiveness. The philosopher's vertigo comes from discovering that our fundamental activities rest on nothing more secure than training and natural human reactions. Yet this groundlessness isn't a skeptical conclusion requiring remedy, but the therapeutic goal itself. What we do is to bring words back from their metaphysical to their everyday use. Wittgenstein explains. The urge to ground rule following in something deeper than human practice reflects philosophical confusion about what explanation can accomplish. Recognizing where explanation properly comes to an end dissolves rather than solves philosophical problems. When we reach the bedrock of human agreement in judgments and reactions, we've arrived not at a foundation requiring further justification, but at the point where justification naturally terminates. If one have exhausted the justifications, one have reached bedrock, and my spade is turned. Then one am inclined to say, this is simply what one do. The philosopher's demand for deeper grounding reflects a picture of explanation that extends beyond its proper limits. This therapeutic approach transforms how we understand domains like mathematics, where logical necessity seems to demand explanation, transcending mere human practice. The sense that mathematical truths must be grounded in something more secure than training and agreement creates the very problems that Wittgenstein's later philosophy dissolves through careful attention to how mathematical practices actually function. Part 8. The Philosophy of Mathematics, Necessity and Human Practice. Mathematical statements present philosophy with a peculiar puzzle. When we encounter 2 plus 2 equals 4, or the square root of 9 is 3, these propositions seem to express necessary truths about abstract mathematical objects or logical relationships that exist independently of human thought. They appear as discoveries about mathematical reality that hold with absolute, incontestable necessity. This creates what philosophers call the Platonistic picture. Mathematical objects inhabit an abstract realm beyond space and time, and mathematical knowledge involves discovering eternal truths about these objects through rational insight or logical proof. We seem to glimpse timeless mathematical facts through the power of pure reason. Yet this traditional view generates profound difficulties. How do minds trapped in physical bodies gain access to abstract mathematical objects? What explains the mysterious harmony between our mathematical concepts and this supposed mathematical reality? How does mathematical necessity differ from mere psychological compulsion or social convention? These puzzles have driven centuries of philosophical speculation about the nature of mathematical truth and mathematical objects. Wittgenstein offers a revolutionary alternative that dissolves these traditional problems entirely. Mathematical statements function not as descriptions of abstract objects but as rules for using number words within our language games. As he observes, the mathematical proposition has, as it were, officially been given the stamp of incontestability. 1. Dispute about other things. This is immovable. It is a hinge on which your dispute can turn. Mathematical propositions serve as fixed points around which our linguistic practices revolve, grammatical rules that determine how we properly use numerical expressions, rather than discoveries about mathematical reality. When we say 2 plus 2 equals 4, we're not describing relationships between abstract numbers, but expressing how we've decided to speak about counting and addition. We call something 4 if it results from adding 2 and 2, because that's the grammatical rule we follow in our mathematical language game. The proposition establishes a standard of correctness for using these symbols, rather than corresponding to facts about mathematical objects. This grammatical reading explains why mathematical statements seem both meaningful and necessary, without requiring mysterious abstract entities. This approach transforms our understanding of mathematical necessity itself. Wittgenstein argues that the necessity of a proposition does not imply that the proposition is a necessary one. Mathematical propositions are rules of grammar. Mathematical necessity reflects the depth of our commitment to certain ways of using symbols rather than correspondence to eternal truths. We treat mathematical propositions as beyond dispute, not because they describe unchangeable features of abstract reality, but because they function as the grammatical foundations that make mathematical discourse possible. This deflationary approach dissolves traditional puzzles about mathematical knowledge and mathematical objects by relocating necessity from metaphysics to grammar. We need not explain how finite minds access infinite mathematical reality, because mathematical propositions establish rules for symbol use rather than describe abstract facts. The feeling of logical compulsion that seems to force certain mathematical conclusions upon us becomes a grammatical phenomenon, reflecting how deeply embedded these rules have become in our mathematical practices. Mathematical reasoning presents us with one of philosophy's most compelling puzzles about the nature of necessity itself. When we work through a mathematical proof, we experience something that feels unmistakably like compulsion, by forces beyond human choice or decision. The steps of a proof seem to unfold with inevitable necessity, each conclusion flowing from premises through logical connections that appear to be discovered rather than created. This phenomenology of mathematical reasoning has long supported Platonistic interpretations of mathematics, suggesting that mathematical truths exist independently of human minds, and that our reasoning simply traces out objective logical relationships in an abstract realm. Wittgenstein acknowledged this powerful experience whilst developing a radically different explanation of what creates this sense of logical compulsion. One want to say, it is essential to mathematics that its signs are also employed in mufti. It is the use outside mathematics, and so the meaning of the signs, that makes the sign game into mathematics. This insight points toward understanding mathematical necessity not as discovery of mind-independent logical facts, but as the product of deeply ingrained human practices and decisions about how to use our words and symbols consistently. The feeling that we are compelled by abstract logical forces reflects something much more fundamental about human life and training. When we follow mathematical rules, we aren't being guided by Platonic entities, but by the extraordinary depth of our commitment to certain ways of speaking and thinking. Mathematical training creates such profound habits of response that alternatives to standard logical moves don't merely seem incorrect, but literally unthinkable. The sense of necessity emerges from the thoroughness with which we have been trained to respond in particular ways, not from contact with abstract logical reality. Wittgenstein captured this insight precisely. You must remember that the language game is, so to say, something unpredictable. One mean, it is not based on grounds. It is not reasonable or unreasonable. It is there, like our life. Thanks for mooring. Mathematical practices exist as fundamental forms of human activity, neither requiring justification by reference to abstract truths, nor reducible to mere arbitrary convention. They are woven into the fabric of human life itself, shaping how we think, speak, and act across countless contexts. This naturalistic approach dissolves the traditional opposition between treating mathematics as objective discovery versus subjective construction. Logic itself emerges as a human institution without being reduced to mere convention. As Wittgenstein observed, the steps which are not brought in question are logical inferences. But the reason why they are not brought in question is not that they certainly correspond to the truth or something of the sort. No, it is just this that is called thinking, speaking, inferring. Logical inference isn't grounded in correspondence to abstract logical facts, but constitutes the very activity we call reasoning itself. This perspective transforms our understanding of mathematical objectivity. Rather than requiring a realm of abstract objects to ground mathematical truth, objectivity emerges from the shared practices and training that create stable, reliable patterns of mathematical reasoning across different contexts and communities. The remarkable consistency of mathematical reasoning reflects the depth and thoroughness of mathematical training, not discovery of mind-independent logical structures that compel particular conclusions. Mathematical and logical truths possess what Wittgenstein called the hardness of the logical must. When we encounter a mathematical proof or logical deduction, we experience an overwhelming sense of necessity, as if we've discovered something that could not possibly be otherwise. This hardness seems to demand explanation. Why do mathematical truths feel so absolute, so resistant to revision, so independent of human opinion or cultural variation? The traditional answer has been Platonism. Mathematical objects exist in an abstract realm, and mathematical truths correspond to the structure of this eternal, unchanging reality. We discover rather than create mathematical facts, which explains their apparent mind independence and necessity. Wittgenstein's revolutionary insight was that this hardness reflects not the discovery of abstract objects, but the role mathematical and logical propositions play in organizing all our other practices. These propositions serve as the stable framework within which empirical investigation, practical reasoning, and everyday communication become possible. Consider what would happen if we seriously questioned basic logical principles like non-contradiction. The very possibility of coherent thought and communication would collapse. We cannot meaningfully doubt that something cannot both be and not be in the same respect, because this principle underlies the possibility of meaningful discourse itself. The hardness we experience is not metaphysical, but practical. These propositions are so deeply embedded in our forms of life that questioning them would undermine the entire edifice of human rational activity. This reveals how Platonistic metaphysics mistakes grammatical necessity for metaphysical necessity. As Wittgenstein observed, what we do is to bring words back from their metaphysical to their everyday use. When we treat mathematical statements as descriptions of abstract objects, we've been misled by surface grammar. The statement 7 plus 5 equals 12 looks grammatically similar to the cat is on the mat, leading us to assume both describe objective facts about entities. But mathematical statements function differently in our language games. They serve as rules for transformation, standards for measurement, and criteria for correctness, rather than descriptions of abstract entities. Mathematical objects don't exist in Platonic realms but are projections of our symbolic practices. Numbers are not inhabitants of a mathematical heaven, but aspects of how we count, measure, and calculate. The number 7 is not a mysterious abstract object, but a position in our counting practices, a standard for grouping, a tool for calculation. When we say there are 7 chairs in the room, we're not claiming that the abstract object 7 somehow relates to physical chairs. We're applying a technique of counting that we've mastered through training and practice. The apparent mind independence of mathematical truth reflects the stability and universality of human mathematical practices rather than correspondence to abstract objects. Mathematical practices are remarkably stable across cultures and historical periods because they serve fundamental human needs: the need to count, measure, calculate, and reason spatially. These practices become so deeply ingrained that they feel natural and inevitable. But this universality stems from shared human forms of life, not from tracking objective mathematical facts. Understanding mathematical necessity means understanding its role in human life rather than discovering its ultimate metaphysical ground. Wittgenstein recognized that mathematics is a motley of techniques of proof. Different areas of mathematics serve different practical purposes without requiring unification under a single metaphysical foundation. Arithmetic serves counting and measuring. Geometry serves spatial reasoning. Algebra serves symbolic manipulation. Part 9. Philosophy of Mind, Dissolving the Cartesian Picture. René Descartes bequeathed to philosophy a picture of mind that continues to dominate our thinking centuries after his death. In his Meditations on First Philosophy, Descartes established what seemed an unshakable foundation for knowledge through his famous cogito ergo sum. Doubting everything he could possibly doubt, he discovered one indubitable truth. The very act of doubting proved his existence as a thinking being. One am, one exist, that is certain, he declared. But what am one? A thing which thinks. What is a thing which thinks? It is a thing which doubts, understands, affirms, denies, wills, refuses. This seemingly innocent observation created a revolutionary division of reality. Descartes split existence into two fundamental substances: res extensa, extended physical substance that occupies space and follows mechanical laws, and res cogitans, thinking substance that exists outside the physical realm entirely. The mind became a private theater where mental episodes play out before an inner observer. Consciousness emerged as an intimate realm accessible only through introspection, a space where thoughts, sensations, emotions, and experiences exist as objects for the contemplating self. This Cartesian picture transforms the mind into something like a private cinema. Just as we might sit in a theater watching images flicker across a screen, the Cartesian self observes mental contents parade through consciousness. Pain becomes a mental object we inspect from within. Thoughts appear as items we can examine in our private mental space. Memory presents past experiences as objects stored in consciousness for later review. The entire rich tapestry of mental life gets reconceived as a collection of private objects accessible only to their owner. Yet this apparently natural picture generates insoluble puzzles that have plagued philosophy for centuries. If mind and body constitute entirely different kinds of substance, how do they interact? How does thinking substance, which lacks physical properties, cause changes in extended substance? When one decides to raise my arm, how does this mental event in res cogitans produce physical motion in res extensa? The problem seems to require either mysterious causal powers bridging two incompatible realms or abandoning the interaction altogether. The problem of other minds emerges with equal force. If mental states exist as private objects in individual consciousness, how can we know that other people possess minds rather than being sophisticated automata? One have direct access to my own mental theater through introspection, but others' mental lives remain forever hidden behind their physical behavior. Their words and actions might indicate inner experience, but they could equally mask empty mechanisms, producing appropriate responses without genuine consciousness. The privacy that seemed to make consciousness special transforms it into an epistemological prison. Modern neuroscience intensifies rather than resolves these puzzles. Brain scans reveal neural activity correlated with reported mental states, but the relationship remains deeply mysterious. How does electrical activity in neurons generate the felt quality of experience? Why should there be anything it feels like to be conscious rather than simply information processing occurring in darkness? The explanatory gap between physical processes and subjective experience appears unbridgeable within the Cartesian framework. Wittgenstein recognized that these problems stem not from the mysterious nature of mind itself, but from a fundamental confusion about the grammar of mental language. We speak of having thoughts, experiencing sensations, feeling emotions, and this grammatical structure misleads us into treating mental terms as names for objects in a private realm. The grammar of the word seems to point to a noun, and so we think of pain as a thing, he observed. The traditional Cartesian picture treats consciousness as a private inner realm, a theater of mental episodes accessible only through introspection. Descartes established the mind as a thinking substance fundamentally different from physical matter, creating what seemed like an elegant solution to the nature of human experience. Yet this very elegance generates insoluble puzzles that have haunted philosophy for centuries. If mental states are private episodes in an inner theater, how can we ever know what occurs in another person's mind? We observe their behavior, hear their words, witness their actions, but the actual mental events remain forever hidden behind the veil of privacy. The problem of other minds emerges with devastating force. If consciousness is truly private, then knowledge of other minds becomes a matter of inference from external behavioral evidence, making such knowledge forever uncertain and indirect. The interaction problem proves equally troubling. If mental and physical constitute fundamentally different kinds of substance, how can they possibly interact? How does a non-physical mind move a physical body? Or how do physical events in the brain generate non-physical mental experiences? The Cartesian framework creates an unbridgeable gulf between mind and matter, leaving their obvious interaction mysterious and seemingly impossible. Behaviorism emerged as a bold attempt to solve these puzzles by eliminating their source entirely. Watson and Skinner proposed identifying mental states with behavioral dispositions, reducing the mental to patterns of stimulus and response. Pain, on this view, simply means the disposition to exhibit pain behavior under certain conditions. Fear becomes the tendency to flee or freeze when confronted with threatening stimuli. The behaviorist claims that mental states are nothing over and above these behavioral patterns. If there are no private mental episodes, then there's nothing hidden to worry about, knowing in others. Yet behaviorism fails to capture something essential about mental concepts. It ignores their normative dimension, the difference between genuine mental states and mere behavioral simulation. The approach cannot distinguish between really being in pain and merely acting as if in pain, between genuine fear and skillful theatrical performance. Mental concepts involve not just behavioral patterns but the appropriateness of those patterns to circumstances, the correctness or incorrectness of their application. Wittgenstein offers a third way that dissolves the original puzzles without reducing mind to behavior. Consciousness isn't a private theater of inner episodes, but neither is it merely behavioral disposition. Instead, consciousness represents a capacity for sophisticated, responsive behavior governed by public criteria. Consciousness in another's face, Wittgenstein observes. Look into someone else's face and see the consciousness in it, and a particular shade of consciousness. You see on it, in it, joy, indifference, interest, excitement, torpor, and so on. This insight transforms our understanding completely. Mental states are aspects of how we live and act in the world, neither separate from behavior nor identical to it. When we see joy in someone's face, we're not inferring a private mental state from external behavioral evidence. We're directly perceiving an aspect of their being in the world, their way of engaging with their circumstances. The criteria for mental states are public and shared, embedded in our forms of life and language games, whilst remaining irreducible to mere behavioral patterns. This approach preserves the reality of consciousness whilst making it accessible to others through public criteria rather than private introspection. Philosophy has long tormented itself with what seemed an insurmountable puzzle. How can we ever know that other people truly have minds? The traditional formulation appears devastatingly simple, yet intractable. One, have direct, immediate access to my own mental states through introspection. When one feel pain, one know it directly and certainly. When one experience joy or anger or fear, these states present themselves to my consciousness with undeniable clarity. But when one observe others, one can only witness their external behavior, their facial expressions, their words, their movements. One must therefore infer their mental states by analogy with my own case, reasoning that since similar behaviors in myself accompany certain mental states, similar behaviors in others probably indicate similar inner experiences. This creates what philosophers have called the problem of other minds. How can one know that others have minds, rather than being sophisticated automata that simulate mental behavior without genuine inner experience? The worry runs deep. Perhaps other people are merely complex biological machines, producing the right responses without any accompanying consciousness. Perhaps one alone possessed genuine mental life whilst everyone else merely mimics its external manifestations. This skeptical doubt appears permanent and irresolvable, built into the very structure of knowledge itself. Wittgenstein recognized that this entire problem rests on a fundamental misconception about how we actually acquire and use mental concepts. The traditional account assumes we first learn what mental states are by examining our own case privately, then apply this knowledge to others. But this reverses the actual developmental process. Children learn mental vocabulary by applying it to others first, not to themselves. A child learns the word pain by responding to others' expressions of distress, by observing how adults react to injury, by participating in the social practices surrounding suffering. They learn anger by recognizing and responding to angry behavior, joy by engaging with joyful expressions. This insight transforms everything. As Wittgenstein observed, we see emotion, as opposed to what? We do not see facial contortions and make the inference that he is feeling joy, grief, boredom. We describe a face immediately as sad, radiant. We don't infer others' mental states from behavioral evidence. We perceive them directly in their expressions and actions. The child who recoils from an angry face isn't making a complex inference about hidden mental states. They're responding immediately to anger itself as it manifests in human behavior. This reversal reveals something even more striking. Our certainty about others' mental states often exceeds our certainty about our own. Consider concrete cases. When you cry out and clutch your injured hand, one can be absolutely certain you're in pain. Your pain behavior provides clear, public criteria that leave no room for doubt. But when one examines my own emotional states, am one truly jealous or merely insecure? Is this genuine anger or wounded pride? The criteria become muddied by self-deception, conflicting motivations, and the very complexity of introspection itself. Wittgenstein captured this perfectly. The traditional problem assumed that first-person access provides superior knowledge, but this assumption crumbles under examination. Mental concepts function as tools for navigating social interactions, not as theoretical descriptions of inner objects. When we recognize this, the other mind's problem simply dissolves. It wasn't solved. It was revealed to be based on false premises about how mental language actually works. The problem arose from treating mental concepts as if they referred to private, internal entities accessible only to their possessor. But mental language evolved for public, social purposes. Part 10. Therapeutic Philosophy. The New Method. Wittgenstein arrived at a startling diagnosis of philosophy itself. The discipline he had devoted his life to was fundamentally diseased. Traditional philosophical problems, he came to realize, were not profound mysteries about reality requiring theoretical solutions, but symptoms of conceptual confusion, what he called mental cramps, caused by misunderstanding how language actually works. In the philosophical investigations, he declared, "Philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language." This was not merely criticism but revolution. Philosophy had been asking the wrong questions entirely. The bewitchment operates through a particular mechanism. Philosophers take ordinary words like knowledge, being, object, one, proposition, or name, and attempt to discover their essential meanings outside any practical context. They imagine these words must refer to something profound and mysterious, something requiring elaborate theoretical explanation. But Wittgenstein saw this as the fundamental error. A philosophical problem, he observed, has the form "one don't know my way about." We become lost in our own conceptual schemes when words are removed from their ordinary contexts and forced into artificial philosophical frameworks. The tragedy is that philosophical theories don't solve these problems. They multiply the confusions by building elaborate systems on conceptual mistakes. Each metaphysical theory generates new puzzles whilst claiming to resolve old ones. Platonism creates the mystery of how abstract objects relate to physical reality. Materialism generates the hard problem of consciousness. Idealism produces the puzzle of other minds. These aren't discoveries about the deep structure of reality. They're symptoms of taking language on holiday from its proper employment. Wittgenstein's therapeutic insight was radical. The real discovery is the one that makes me capable of stopping doing philosophy when one wants to. The one that gives philosophy peace, so that it is no longer tormented by questions which bring itself in question. Philosophy had become a self-perpetuating disease, generating ever more complex theories to solve problems that arose from its own theoretical assumptions. The cure was not better theories, but abandoning the theoretical approach altogether. The therapeutic method operates by returning words from their metaphysical to their everyday employment. When philosophers use fundamental terms, Wittgenstein insisted, one must always ask oneself, is the word ever actually used in this way in the language game, which is its original home? The question dissolves philosophical problems by revealing how they arise from linguistic misunderstandings rather than genuine metaphysical mysteries. Philosophy becomes therapy, not building theories about reality, but curing the intellectual ailments that theoretical philosophy creates. Philosophy undergoes a fundamental transformation when it abandons the construction of theories and embraces the assembly of reminders. Wittgenstein revolutionized philosophical methodology by recognizing that our deepest conceptual confusions arise not from ignorance, but from a peculiar blindness to what lies before us. The work of the philosopher consists in assembling reminders for a particular purpose, he wrote in the Investigations, capturing the essence of therapeutic philosophy. These reminders don't deliver new information about the world. They rearrange what we already know, helping us see familiar practices from perspectives that dissolve the problems that seem to demand theoretical solutions. The method operates through careful attention to how words actually function in ordinary contexts, rather than through speculation about how language must work according to some philosophical theory. When philosophers become puzzled about the nature of mind, meaning, or knowledge, they typically construct elaborate theories to explain these phenomena. Wittgenstein's therapeutic approach proceeds differently. It assembles examples of how we actually use psychological terms, meaning expressions, and knowledge claims in everyday contexts, showing how these ordinary uses already contain the conceptual resources we need to dissolve our philosophical perplexities. Consider how this method transforms our understanding of mental phenomena through the beetle-in-the-box thought experiment. Rather than theorizing about the nature of private mental objects, Wittgenstein assembles a reminder about how language actually works in contexts where we cannot verify what others possess. If everyone carried a beetle in a box that only they could see, the word beetle would function in our language regardless of what anyone actually had in their box, or whether they had anything at all. This example doesn't prove a theory about consciousness. It shifts our perspective on what seemed problematic about mental privacy, showing how the grammar of psychological language already accommodates the phenomena that philosophers struggle to explain theoretically. The therapeutic power of examples lies precisely in their ability to create new ways of seeing rather than establishing doctrines. Wittgenstein's primitive language games serve as particularly powerful reminders because they strip away the complexity that obscures the basic functioning of linguistic practices. When builders communicate using only slab and block, we see clearly how meaning emerges through coordinated activity rather than through mysterious mental processes or abstract semantic relationships. These simple examples illuminate the complex cases by showing how language games can function without the theoretical machinery philosophers typically invoke to explain meaning. The toolbox analogy operates similarly, reminding us that words function like tools in a carpenter's kit rather than like labels attached to objects. What we do is to bring words back from their metaphysical to their everyday use. Wittgenstein observed, capturing how therapeutic examples work by relocating philosophical concepts within the ordinary contexts where they naturally belong. A hammer, screwdriver, and measuring tape serve different functions within carpentry practices. Similarly, words like know, believe, mean, and understand serve different functions within language games, rather than naming different types of mental states or processes. This method aims at achieving what Wittgenstein called a perspicuous representation of our linguistic practices. A main source of our failure to understand is that we do not command a clear view of the use of our words, he diagnosed. Our grammar is lacking in this sort of perspicuity. Philosophy, for Wittgenstein, reaches its proper conclusion not through grand theoretical achievements, but through a peculiar kind of liberation. In the philosophical investigations, he offers a striking metaphor that captures his entire therapeutic vision. What is your aim in philosophy? To shoo the fly the way out of the fly bottle. This image reveals something profound about the nature of philosophical problems and their resolution. The fly bottle presents a perfect trap. Transparent glass creates the illusion of open space, whilst actually forming an impenetrable barrier. The fly batters itself against invisible walls, exhausting itself in futile attempts to reach what appears accessible. Yet the bottle remains open at the top. Escape is always possible, but only by abandoning the assumptions that created the predicament. The fly becomes trapped not by the bottle's structure but by its own instinctive approach to navigation. Philosophical problems mirror this predicament precisely. We find ourselves imprisoned by conceptual confusions that seem as solid as glass walls. Yet these barriers exist only in our theoretical assumptions about how problems must be solved. Traditional philosophy resembles the fly's frantic buzzing, generating elaborate theories, constructing systematic arguments, seeking foundational principles, all whilst remaining trapped within the very conceptual framework that created the puzzle. The therapeutic method shows the way out not by breaking through these invisible barriers, but by helping us recognize that we've been trying to escape through solid glass when the opening lies elsewhere entirely. This transformation of philosophical method demands a radical reconceptualization of success. Wittgenstein insists that philosophy may in no way interfere with the actual use of language. It can, in the end, only describe it, for it cannot give it any foundation either. It leaves everything as it is. This isn't conservative quietism, but recognition of something remarkable. Ordinary language works perfectly well for ordinary purposes. We successfully communicate, make plans, express emotions, conduct business, create art, all without the theoretical foundations that philosophers demand. Philosophical problems arise when we abstract from these working contexts and impose impossible standards of precision or theoretical grounding. We ask what knowledge really is, what consciousness fundamentally consists of, how language connects to reality, as if our ordinary practices of knowing, experiencing, and speaking were somehow defective without philosophical foundations. Yet successful therapy reveals that these practices need no such foundations. They function perfectly well within their natural contexts. Philosophy leaves everything as it is because everything was already working properly before philosophy arrived to create problems. The sign of philosophical health becomes the ability to stop doing philosophy when problems dissolve. Wittgenstein observes that the problems are solved not by giving new information, but by arranging what we have always known. Philosophy is a battle against the bewitchment of our intelligence by means of language. The therapeutic method succeeds when we cease being puzzled by what once seemed deeply mysterious. Not because we've answered all questions, but because we've recognized which questions rest on conceptual confusions. This represents philosophy's proper end in both senses, its ultimate purpose and its natural conclusion. When the fly finds its way out of the bottle, it doesn't need to understand the principles of glass manufacture or develop a theory of transparent barriers. It simply flies away, returning to the activities that constitute its natural life. Similarly, when philosophical therapy succeeds, we return to our ordinary practices with renewed clarity, no longer tormented by problems that seem to demand theoretical solutions. In the philosophical investigations, Wittgenstein issues what might be the most revolutionary directive in 20th century philosophy. Don't think, but look. This deceptively simple command appears in section 66, precisely where he examines our concept of games. Rather than constructing theories about what all games must have in common, Wittgenstein urges us to look at actual examples: board games, card games, ball games, Olympic games. What we discover through careful observation shatters our theoretical expectations. We find no single essence uniting all games, no common property that makes them games. Instead, we see overlapping resemblances, what he calls family resemblances, a complex network of similarities with no single thread running through them all. This therapeutic injunction encapsulates Wittgenstein's complete methodological transformation. Traditional philosophy operates through a priori reasoning, seeking necessary truths about concepts through pure thought. We ask, what must language be? What must knowledge be? What must meaning be? Wittgenstein's revolutionary insight recognizes that this entire approach generates the very problems it attempts to solve. When we theorize about how language must work, we create artificial requirements that actual linguistic practice never meets. The gap between our theoretical demands and linguistic reality produces philosophical puzzles that seem to require ever more elaborate theoretical solutions. The therapeutic power of don't think, but look is less than #0. 5# is greater than extends far beyond the analysis of games. It applies to every philosophical problem that has plagued the tradition. Instead of spinning theories about how language must work, we should investigate how it actually works in concrete cases. Wittgenstein insists that we must do away with all explanation and description alone must take its place. This represents more than methodological preference. It constitutes philosophical therapy. Detailed description of actual linguistic practices dissolves theoretical puzzles that arise when we abstract from those practices. Consider how this works. Traditional philosophy asks, how do words get their meanings? It then constructs elaborate theories. Words name objects, or express ideas, or correspond to mental states. Each theory creates new problems requiring further theoretical machinery. Wittgenstein's therapeutic approach simply observes, look at how we actually use words in concrete situations. A child learns red, not by grasping an abstract concept, but by participating in language games where adults say, bring me the red book, or look at the red flower. Meaning emerges through use in context, not through theoretical correspondence relations. This therapeutic redirection of attention reveals that philosophical problems often rest on false assumptions about how concepts must function rather than on genuine mysteries requiring theoretical solutions. The confusion arises, as Wittgenstein puts it, when language is like an engine idling, not when it is doing work. We become mesmerized by words divorced from their practical contexts, spinning theoretical wheels that generate heat, but no illumination. Returning attention to language at work in concrete contexts provides what Wittgenstein calls perspicuous representation, a clear view that allows philosophical problems to dissolve rather than requiring solution. The therapeutic injunction thus transforms our understanding of philosophy's task. We are not constructing theories about reality's ultimate structure, but dissolving conceptual confusions that arise when we misunderstand our own linguistic practices. This approach proves more powerful than elaborate theoretical constructions because it addresses the root cause of philosophical confusion, our tendency to be misled by grammatical analogies and theoretical preconceptions into depals, thinking problems exist where none actually do. Part 11. Language and World. The New Relationship. Wittgenstein's later philosophy achieves something remarkable. It dissolves the entire framework that made his early picture theory seem necessary. Where the Tractus demanded that language mirror reality's logical structure through precise correspondence between propositions and facts, the philosophical investigations reveals language woven directly into the fabric of human activities. As Wittgenstein puts it in section 23, the speaking of language is part of an activity or of a form of life. This isn't merely a different theory of how language relates to world. It's a complete reconception of what that relationship could possibly be. The shift from mirroring to weaving captures something profound about language's actual place in human existence. The Tractarian picture required language to stand apart from reality, representing it through shared logical form. But this separation created the very problems that tortured the early Wittgenstein. How does language make contact with reality? How do we bridge the gap between words and world? The later Wittgenstein shows these problems dissolve once we recognize that language never stood apart from reality in the first place. Words don't represent human activities. They are human activities, embedded in the practical contexts that give them life and meaning. Consider how water connects to water. The Tractarian approach would seek the logical structure that allows this word to correspond to that substance. But Wittgenstein now sees that water gets its meaning not through correspondence, but through integration into practices. Requesting at dinner, warning of danger, identifying a substance, expressing relief at finding a well. The word works because it's woven into successful patterns of human activity, not because it mirrors water's essential nature. This practical connection explains both language's remarkable effectiveness and its context sensitivity. The same word functions differently across different practices, whilst maintaining its connection to the world through those very practices. This weaving metaphor reveals something crucial. Words have meaning only in what Wittgenstein calls the stream of life. Language isn't a separate realm that occasionally touches reality through correspondence relations. It's part of reality, embedded in the activities that constitute human existence. When we speak, we're not representing the world from outside it. We're acting within it, using words as tools integrated into practical contexts. The baker who shouts, "5 red apples," isn't creating a logical picture of a state of affairs. He's participating in the complex social practice we call commerce, using words that derive their meaning from their role in that practice. This transformation has profound implications for understanding language's diversity. Where the tractor sought a single logical form underlying all meaningful discourse, Wittgenstein now recognizes that different language games relate to reality in fundamentally different ways. Describing, commanding, promising, expressing, joking, and praying each have their own criteria for success, their own ways of connecting words to world. A promise doesn't succeed by corresponding to a fact. It succeeds by creating a commitment within social practices. A joke doesn't fail by misrepresenting reality. It fails by falling flat within the context of humor. Wittgenstein captures this insight beautifully. Our language can be seen as an ancient city, a maze of little streets and squares, of old and new houses, and of houses with additions from various periods. Each district of this linguistic city has its own character, its own ways of functioning, its own relationship to the activities that surround it. The commercial district operates differently from the residential area, which differs again from the religious quarter. Ordinary language works brilliantly for ordinary purposes. We successfully coordinate complex activities, express subtle emotions, make binding promises, share jokes that depend on precise timing and cultural understanding, and navigate intricate social relationships, all using language that philosophers often dismiss as imprecise, ambiguous, or logically defective. When you ask someone to pass the salt at dinner, point out that it's getting late, or promise to call soon, these utterances accomplish exactly what they need to accomplish within their contexts. The supposed imprecision that troubles philosophers, the fact that soon doesn't specify an exact time frame, that late depends on circumstances, that pass could mean various physical movements, poses no obstacle to successful communication. Philosophical problems arise precisely when we abstract words from these working contexts and demand impossible precision. Philosophy asks, what is knowledge, really? What is meaning as such? What is the essence of language? These questions tear concepts away from the practices that give them life and then wonder why they become problematic. Wittgenstein recognized that this abstraction creates artificial difficulties. When we remove knowledge from contexts where people actually claim to know things, doubt things, verify things, and use their knowledge to act effectively in the world, we're left with a ghostly concept that seems to demand theoretical definition but resists all attempts at precise analysis. The famous metaphor from philosophical investigations captures this predicament perfectly. We have got on to slippery ice where there is no friction. We want to walk, so we need friction. Back to the rough ground. Philosophical abstraction creates frictionless surfaces where our concepts can't get grip. When we try to use words like meaning, mind, or rule in purely theoretical contexts, stripped of their connections to concrete activities and practices, they lose their capacity to do meaningful work. They slide around helplessly, generating paradoxes and puzzles that seem profound but actually result from this artificial isolation. The rough ground of ordinary language provides the friction needed for meaningful communication through its embeddedness in concrete practices and forms of life. Words gain their sense not through correspondence to abstract entities, but through their role in activities that matter to us. Game makes perfect sense when we're organizing a football match, choosing a board game, or teaching children to play. Despite lacking the precise boundaries that would satisfy a philosophical definition, the concept works because it's woven into practices of playing, competing, rule-following, and entertainment, not because it corresponds to some theoretical essence of gamehood. Returning to ordinary usage dissolves, rather than solves, philosophical problems. As Wittgenstein puts it, what we do is to bring words back from their metaphysical to their everyday use. The philosophical problem of other minds, for instance, dissolves when we stop treating mind as a theoretical entity requiring proof of existence and return to investigating how psychological concepts actually function. We don't typically doubt whether others have minds when we see them wince in pain, laugh at jokes, or concentrate on difficult tasks. The doubt arises only when philosophy abstracts mind from these manifest expressions and treats it as something hidden behind behavior. This therapeutic approach doesn't mean ordinary language is immune from criticism or improvement. Scientific terminology, legal precision, and technical vocabularies serve essential purposes that ordinary language cannot fulfill. Rather, philosophical problems typically arise from misunderstanding how ordinary language already works, rather than from genuine defects requiring theoretical correction. Grammar doesn't mirror reality's structure. It constitutes the boundaries of what we can meaningfully say. Wittgenstein's mature insight cuts through centuries of philosophical confusion about language's relationship to the world. Essence is expressed by grammar, he declares in the Philosophical Investigations, revealing a fundamental shift from his earlier Tractarian vision, where the young Wittgenstein sought logical structure underlying both language and reality. The later philosopher recognizes that grammar creates the conceptual space within which meaningful discourse becomes possible. This transformation represents one of philosophy's most profound reversals. Grammar no longer reflects some deep, logical architecture of the world. Instead, it shapes what we can meaningfully think and say about our experience. Different grammars make different things sayable, but this doesn't imply that reality itself bends to linguistic whim. Rather, our grammatical resources determine which aspects of reality we can meaningfully engage with, which questions we can coherently ask, which distinctions we can draw. Consider how different grammars create entirely different conceptual possibilities without making metaphysical claims about reality's ultimate structure. The grammar of color words varies dramatically across languages. Some cultures have single terms covering what English speakers distinguish as blue and green, whilst others divide our spectrum of red into multiple distinct categories. These grammatical differences create different ways of organizing color experience, different patterns of attention and discrimination. Yet this doesn't suggest that colors themselves are language-relative phenomena floating freely in some linguistic void. Wittgenstein's crucial insight emerges clearly. Grammar tells us what kind of object anything is. This revelation transforms our understanding of philosophical investigation itself. Grammatical analysis doesn't reveal metaphysical truths about reality's deep structure. It illuminates conceptual possibilities and impossibilities. It shows what makes sense to say and what doesn't, what questions can meaningfully be asked, and what apparent questions rest on conceptual confusion, masquerading as profound inquiry. The implications extend far beyond technical philosophy of language. Understanding what we can and cannot meaningfully say illuminates both language and the human condition itself. When Wittgenstein observes that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world, he's not making reality language dependent. He's revealing how our conceptual resources shape which aspects of reality we can meaningfully engage with, which features of experience we can articulate, which possibilities we can even conceive. This insight transforms grammatical investigation into a form of anthropological inquiry. Examining the grammar of psychological concepts reveals how human beings organize their understanding of mind and emotion. Studying the grammar of moral language illuminates the conceptual frameworks through which ethical life becomes possible. Investigating the grammar of mathematical discourse shows how abstract reasoning creates its own conceptual domains. The boundaries of sense aren't arbitrary limitations. They're the very conditions that make meaningful discourse possible. Without grammatical constraints, language would dissolve into meaningless noise. The limits create the space within which significance can emerge. Just as the banks of a river don't restrict the water, but give it direction and force. This recognition carries us toward a deeper understanding of Wittgenstein's philosophical transformation and what remains constant throughout his intellectual journey. The conviction that clarity about language's actual functioning can dissolve the conceptual confusions that generate traditional philosophical problems. Part 12. The continuity question. Early and late. Wittgenstein. The later Wittgenstein offers a startling reinterpretation of his early masterwork. The Tractus Logico-Philosophicus, he suggests, was never meant as systematic, metaphysical doctrine, but as therapeutic clarification from the very beginning. This reading transforms our understanding of both periods entirely. The propositions that seem to establish logical atomism and the picture theory of meaning were, according to this retrospective view, always intended as nonsensical, but illuminating nonsense that serves a crucial clarifying purpose before being discarded. Proposition 6.54 becomes central to this therapeutic reading. My propositions serve as elucidations in the following way. Anyone who understands me eventually recognizes them as nonsensical when he has used them as steps to climb up beyond them. The metaphor is striking. The Tractus functions like a ladder that enables philosophical ascent, but must be thrown away once the climb is complete. The propositions about logical form, elementary propositions, and the structure of reality were never meant to describe metaphysical truths, but to show something about the nature of meaningful discourse by pushing language to its limits until it collapses into recognized nonsense. This therapeutic interpretation reveals profound continuity between early and late Wittgenstein. Both periods share the fundamental goal of showing philosophy's proper limits and returning us to ordinary ways of speaking and thinking. The anti-metaphysical stance remains constant throughout his work. Both early and late periods reject traditional philosophical system building and seek to dissolve rather than solve philosophical problems through conceptual clarification. The continuity appears in parallel formulations across both periods. The Tractarian declaration, "Whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent," finds its echo in the later assertion that philosophy may in no way interfere with the actual use of language. It leaves everything as it is. Both formulations express deep respect for philosophy's proper boundaries and reject the traditional philosophical ambition to transcend ordinary discourse through theoretical construction. Yet the difference lies crucially in method rather than ultimate goal. The Tractus attempts to show these limits through systematic theory, one final, complete philosophical system that would reveal all meaningful discourses' logical structure and thereby end philosophy by completing it. The Investigations abandon systematic theory entirely in favor of piecemeal therapeutic interventions using practical examples and ordinary language analysis. The early period believed philosophical confusion could be eliminated through theoretical construction that would map language's logical geography once and for all. The later period recognizes that philosophical problems emerge precisely from this systematic ambition and can only be dissolved through patient attention to how language actually functions in specific contexts. Both approaches ultimately aim to free us from philosophical confusion, but they disagree fundamentally about whether this liberation requires theoretical construction or practical investigation. This tension between systematic completion and therapeutic intervention reveals the deeper question of what philosophical silence means and how ordinary speech relates to philosophical discourse. Early Wittgenstein constructed his philosophy around a profound act of protection. He sought to preserve what matters most in human existence, ethics, aesthetics, the meaning of life itself, through respectful silence about what cannot be meaningfully said. The Tractus draws its famous boundary between the sayable and the unsayable, not to dismiss value and meaning, but to shield them from the corrupting touch of factual discourse. The sense of the world must lie outside the world. In the world, everything is as it is, and everything happens as it does happen. In it, no value exists, and if it did exist, it would have no value. This creates a sharp division. Factual propositions belong to language and can be spoken, whilst what gives life its significance transcends linguistic expression entirely. This protective silence, however, created an impoverished view of ordinary language itself. The Tractarian system could account only for propositions that picture facts, statements that correspond to possible states of affairs in the world. This left vast domains of meaningful human discourse in a peculiar position. When we promise, forgive, celebrate, mourn, joke, or pray, we engage in activities that clearly matter to us, yet none of these fit the Tractarian model of meaningful speech. They neither picture facts nor remain properly silent about the mystical. The paradox becomes acute. Most of what we actually do with language falls outside the boundaries of meaningful discourse, as the Tractus conceived it. Late Wittgenstein discovers something remarkable. The values and meanings that seem to require protection from language are already suffused throughout ordinary linguistic practice. The speaking of language is part of an activity, or of a form of life. The mystical doesn't need protection through silence because it shows itself in language's ordinary functioning, in the human activities, responses, and forms of life that give words their significance. When we comfort someone in grief or share joy in celebration, we aren't corrupting transcendent meaning by dragging it into factual discourse. We are participating in the very activities through which meaning manifests itself. This transforms the relationship between the sayable and the unsayable entirely. Instead of a sharp boundary protecting transcendent meaning through silence, we find meaning woven throughout the fabric of ordinary linguistic practice. The later philosophy doesn't abandon what the early work sought to protect. It discovers that protection was unnecessary because meaning was never threatened in the first place. What seemed to require silence to preserve its dignity reveals itself as already present in the speaking itself. The most striking feature of Wittgenstein's philosophical transformation lies not in what changed, but in what remained constant throughout both periods of his work. Beneath the dramatic shift from logical atomism to language games runs a persistent conviction about philosophy's fundamental limitations and proper role. Both the early and late Wittgenstein insist that philosophy cannot solve life's deepest problems through theoretical construction, and both periods culminate in the same remarkable insight. True philosophical understanding involves recognizing the boundaries of philosophical explanation itself. This continuity emerges clearly when we place two seemingly disparate quotations side by side. From the Tractus, we feel that even when all possible scientific questions have been answered, the problems of life remain completely untouched. From the Investigations era, philosophy leaves everything as it is. These formulations, separated by decades and expressing radically different approaches to language and meaning, nevertheless articulate the same fundamental insight about philosophy's limitations. Neither theoretical construction nor conceptual analysis can provide solutions to existential problems or foundational justifications for human practices. Philosophy's proper task lies elsewhere entirely. The continuity becomes even more apparent when we examine what both periods seek to accomplish. The early period's mystical silence and the later period's therapeutic dissolution both aim to free us from the illusion that philosophical theory can solve life's fundamental problems. Both approaches cure philosophical confusion by returning us to unreflective engagement with life itself. Wittgenstein's persistent insight echoes throughout both periods. The solution of the problem of life is seen in the vanishing of the problem. Whether through throwing away the ladder of logical analysis or dissolving language games gone idle, both approaches point beyond philosophy toward direct engagement with what shows itself. What changes between the periods is the location of what shows itself. The early Wittgenstein locates meaning in logical structure that transcends ordinary language, whilst the later Wittgenstein finds it in practical mastery embedded within forms of life. Yet both periods ultimately point beyond philosophy toward the same destination: ordinary life freed from philosophical confusion. The early period's ladder-throwing and the later period's therapeutic dissolution serve identical functions, clearing away conceptual debris that prevents us from seeing clearly what is already before us. This reveals Wittgenstein's persistent vision of philosophy's proper modesty. Philosophy cannot construct theories that explain the meaning of life, establish foundations for knowledge, or solve existential problems through conceptual analysis. But it can perform the valuable service of clearing away confusions that prevent us from engaging directly with life as it actually unfolds. Both periods insist that philosophical problems arise from misunderstanding the logic of our language, and both offer methods for dissolving rather than solving these pseudo-problems. The therapeutic dimension runs through both periods, though it takes different forms. Early Wittgenstein's logical analysis reveals the senselessness of traditional metaphysical questions, whilst late Wittgenstein's attention to ordinary language shows how philosophical problems dissolve when we examine how words actually function in living contexts. Both approaches share the same diagnostic insight. Philosophical confusion arises when we mistake the grammar of our expressions for descriptions of reality's ultimate structure. This persistent vision has profoundly influenced subsequent philosophical practice, establishing a tradition that views philosophy's primary task as clarification rather than construction, therapy rather than theory building. Part 13. Wittgenstein's Legacy. The transformation of philosophy. Wittgenstein's revolutionary insights about language games and the therapeutic nature of philosophy didn't remain confined to his notebooks and lectures. A generation of philosophers, particularly at Oxford, seized upon his recognition that philosophical problems often arise from misunderstanding how language actually works in ordinary contexts. They transformed his therapeutic approach into systematic investigations of linguistic practices, developing what became known as ordinary language philosophy. J. 50. Austin exemplified this transformation most clearly. He took Wittgenstein's insight that language is fundamentally action, that speaking is doing something in the world rather than merely describing it, and developed it into a comprehensive theory of speech, acts. Austin's analysis of performative utterances revealed how certain statements don't describe reality, but actually create it. When someone says, "one promise," "one apologize," or "one pronounce you married," they aren't reporting on some inner state or external fact. They're performing an action that changes the social reality around them. Austin captured this insight perfectly. To say something is to do something. This wasn't merely clever wordplay, but a fundamental recognition that language games are woven into the fabric of human activities, rather than standing apart from them as abstract representations. Austin's speech act theory showed how Wittgenstein's therapeutic insights could generate systematic philosophical investigations. Where Wittgenstein had dissolved the traditional picture of language as primarily descriptive, Austin constructed a positive theory of how language functions as action. He analyzed the conditions under which performative utterances succeed or fail, the implicit rules governing different types of speech acts, and the ways linguistic practices create and sustain social institutions. This represented both a continuation and a transformation of Wittgensteinian themes, maintaining the focus on actual linguistic practices, whilst developing systematic theoretical frameworks that Wittgenstein himself might have viewed with suspicion. Gilbert Ryle pursued a parallel development in philosophy of mind, extending Wittgenstein's dissolution of the Cartesian picture into a sustained attack on what he memorably called the ghost in the machine. Ryle's analysis revealed how traditional mind-body problems arose from treating mental concepts as if they named mysterious inner objects rather than describing patterns of behavior, capacity, and disposition. When we call someone intelligent, we're not pointing to some occult inner faculty, but describing their ability to solve problems, learn quickly, and adapt to new situations. Intelligence isn't a thing, but a way of characterizing how someone typically acts and responds. Ryle's insight cut deeper than behaviorism, though it was often confused with it. He wasn't reducing mind to observable behavior, but showing how mental concepts function logically in ordinary language. The mind is not the topic of sets of untestable categorical propositions, but the topic of sets of testable hypothetical and semi-hypothetical propositions, he argued. Mental terms describe dispositions and capacities, what someone would do or could do under various circumstances, rather than naming inner states. This therapeutic approach dissolved traditional philosophical problems about the relationship between mental and physical without requiring any reductive theory. The problems simply evaporated once we understood how mental language actually works. Both Austin and Ryle demonstrated how Wittgenstein's therapeutic methodology could generate positive philosophical results. They showed that investigating ordinary linguistic practices reveals implicit logical structures and conceptual relationships that traditional philosophy had obscured. Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations continue to reverberate through contemporary debates with remarkable persistence, generating interpretive controversies that reveal the radical nature of his insights. The rule-following considerations from the philosophical investigations have become a battleground for competing visions of meaning itself. Saul Kripke's influential interpretation presents Wittgenstein's argument as a skeptical paradox. No fact about my mental states determines what one means by a word like plus, creating a crisis that requires what Kripke calls a skeptical solution through community agreement rather than individual mental content. This interpretation sparked fierce debate about whether Wittgenstein was advancing meaning skepticism or dissolving skeptical problems through therapeutic investigation. John McDowell argues forcefully that Wittgenstein's goal was therapeutic rather than skeptical, showing how rule-following actually works in our practices rather than explaining how it's metaphysically possible. The debate reveals fundamental disagreements about philosophical method itself, whether Wittgenstein was constructing theories about meaning or demonstrating why such theories generate confusion. These interpretive battles extend directly into philosophy of mind, where the private language argument continues to shape debates about consciousness and subjective experience. Contemporary discussions of qualia, phenomenal consciousness, and the explanatory gap between physical processes and subjective experience often invoke Wittgensteinian insights, though with radically different conclusions. Daniel Dennett draws on these arguments to suggest that consciousness problems dissolve when we investigate how mental concepts actually function in language games, arguing that apparent mysteries about subjective experience arise from conceptual confusion rather than genuine metaphysical puzzles. Yet philosophers like David Chalmers maintain that genuine explanatory problems remain even after Wittgensteinian therapy, arguing that the hard problem of consciousness survives grammatical investigation. These debates often involve competing interpretations of what Wittgenstein's arguments actually establish, whether they eliminate philosophical problems or redirect them toward empirical investigation. The therapeutic approach has influenced fields far beyond philosophy of language. In ethics, philosophers like Bernard Williams developed critiques of systematic moral theory that echo Wittgenstein's suspicion of philosophical systematicity. Williams argued that moral philosophy's search for theoretical foundations misunderstands how ethical concepts actually function in human life, preferring thick, ethical concepts embedded in particular practices over thin universal principles. Charles Taylor similarly draws on Wittgensteinian insights in political philosophy, arguing that liberal political theory often abstracts from the language, games, and cultural contexts that give political concepts their meaning. Contemporary debates about moral realism, political legitimacy, and aesthetic judgment frequently involve questions about whether philosophical problems require theoretical solutions or therapeutic dissolution. Wittgenstein's influence extends into virtually every area of philosophical inquiry, challenging the assumption that philosophy's task is building systematic theories rather than investigating the conceptual confusions that generate apparent problems. This ongoing relevance demonstrates how Wittgenstein's transformation of philosophy continues to reshape contemporary thought. The therapeutic revolution Wittgenstein initiated promised to dissolve philosophy's perennial puzzles. Yet 60 years later, the fundamental questions he sought to eliminate refused to disappear. Critics argue that his approach doesn't solve philosophical problems so much as change the subject entirely, avoiding rather than addressing genuine questions about truth, knowledge, reality, and value. Thomas Nagel captures this resistance when he insists that the view from nowhere reveals authentic metaphysical questions that cannot be dissolved through attention to ordinary language use. For Nagel and others, consciousness, free will, and moral objectivity present genuine philosophical problems that demand theoretical solutions, not therapeutic dissolution. They argue that Wittgenstein's approach abandons philosophy's most important work, understanding the fundamental nature of reality and our place within it. This criticism reveals a deeper disagreement about philosophy's proper aims and methods. Should philosophy construct theories about fundamental reality, or must it limit itself to conceptual therapy? Wittgenstein's therapeutic approach assumes that traditional philosophical problems arise from linguistic confusion, but critics maintain that some problems reflect genuine features of reality that resist dissolution. The debate continues because it touches the very heart of what philosophy should accomplish. Equally persistent is the tension between Wittgenstein's descriptive claims and his apparently normative practice. He insisted that philosophy leaves everything as it is, merely describing how language actually functions rather than prescribing how it should function. Yet his therapeutic interventions clearly involve normative judgments about which ways of speaking are confused or misleading. When Wittgenstein shows us that our philosophical puzzlement about consciousness or meaning stems from misunderstanding language's ordinary operation, he seems to be telling us how we ought to think and speak. His dissolution of the private language argument doesn't merely describe linguistic practice. It demonstrates that certain philosophical approaches are fundamentally misguided. This apparent contradiction between descriptive methodology and normative conclusions continues to generate scholarly debate. The tension reflects broader questions about whether philosophical analysis can remain neutral. Even purely descriptive philosophy makes implicit claims about what counts as clarity, what constitutes genuine problems, and what forms of reasoning deserve attention. Wittgenstein's therapeutic approach, despite its anti-theoretical stance, embeds particular views about language, mind, and philosophical method. Perhaps most troubling for therapeutic philosophy are persistent questions about relativism. Wittgenstein's emphasis on forms of life and language games suggests that truth and meaning depend on particular practices and communities. Different language games seem to create different standards of correctness, different criteria for truth, different ways of making sense. Yet Wittgenstein clearly believes some philosophical approaches are confused whilst others are clarifying. His confidence in dissolving traditional problems assumes that some ways of understanding language and meaning are objectively superior to others. Contemporary debates continue over whether Wittgensteinian approaches can preserve objectivity whilst avoiding relativistic conclusions about truth and knowledge. The tension between systematic and anti-systematic readings of Wittgenstein reflects these deeper questions about philosophy's nature. Can philosophy avoid theoretical commitments while still making progress on traditional philosophical problems? Wittgenstein's legacy remains contested precisely because it challenges philosophy's foundational assumptions about its own methods and goals, yet the problems it sought to dissolve continue demanding our attention. Part 14. Conclusion. Wittgenstein's philosophical journey from logical atomism to therapeutic dissolution mirrors philosophy's own transformation in the 20th century, marking a fundamental shift from systematic theory building to therapeutic investigation of conceptual functioning. Where traditional philosophy sought ultimate grounds for knowledge and meaning through foundationalist projects, Wittgenstein pioneered a more modest investigation of how concepts actually work in human life. His early declaration that the problems of philosophy have been finally solved through logical analysis gave way to the later insight that the problems are solved not by giving new information, but by arranging what we have always known. Both formulations express the same anti-theoretical impulse despite their methodological differences, revealing a consistent vision of philosophy's proper limits and its task of returning us to ordinary engagement with life. The revolution from his early vision of language as logical mirror to understanding language as woven into the fabric of human activities represents one of philosophy's most dramatic transformations, yet both periods sought to show philosophy's boundaries and restore natural human engagement with the world. The continuity in his therapeutic goals persists, despite radical methodological change, from systematic theory to piecemeal dissolution, from structural correspondence to practical use, from mystical silence to ordinary speech. This transformation from correspondence to use, from private objects to public criteria, from theoretical solutions to therapeutic dissolution, fundamentally changed how we understand meaning, mind, and reality, whilst preserving his core insight about philosophy's essential limitations. Wittgenstein's lasting contribution lies not in particular doctrines but in demonstrating how philosophical problems often dissolve when we investigate how language actually works rather than how we think it must work. His therapeutic insight that what we do is to bring words back from their metaphysical to their everyday use reveals that the deepest philosophical insights emerge not from constructing theories about language and reality, from achieving clarity about the human practices through which both language and reality show themselves in ordinary life. This persistent vision that philosophy's proper task involves clearing away conceptual confusions that prevent us from seeing clearly what stands before us continues to challenge and transform philosophical practice, offering not a new philosophical system, but a revolutionary understanding of what philosophy can and cannot accomplish in human existence.